All right. Good evening, everybody. Um, this is mostly going to be hosted by TCPS. So he's mostly going to basically talk about. He's mostly going to talk about a lot of the contradictions within the American system and ideology. Oh, good to
So
see you
yeah,
here,
so,
Chris. All right, go ahead.
so there's a lot of things that we're living in a false dialectic where both sides are essentially lying. And I've come to that realization really for quite a while, but it's really been hammered home within the last day or so. I've done a lot of deep dives and a lot of research from a lot of mainstream surveys, studies, and opinion-based research, opinion polling. And it seems as though there's a lot of things that are being hidden underground that don't quite meet the eye. We very much think at the outset, oh well, there's a left-right dialectic, right? And that the left of today are basically a bunch of internationalist globalists who are pushing for an internationalist globalist agenda. Meanwhile, the right are the nationalists that are saying, no, let's get beyond that. Let's, get beyond. And oftentimes the right of today will accuse the left of today of selling out to these, outdated neoliberal George W. Bush era principles. And they'll say, oh, that stuff's all failed. Let's get with the times and let's basically let's not be so quick to intervene. Let's be America first, right? That's the big slogan for the right. But what I've come to realize is that whole thing is a complete scam. So we're going to start off by talking about the utter scam of this America First movement, this supposed paleo-conservative, anti-war, anti-interventionist movement. As can be found in the surveys, the entirety, largely what Donald Trump's base was in 2016 was neocons. It was people who held a George W. Bush era understanding of foreign policy, and that was quite a hotly debated topic in the 2016 election. A lot of people remember the 2016 election as being characterized by what? It was characterized by struggles over immigration. It was characterized by questions over the nationalization and naturalization of immigrants, whether immigrants could really adapt to an American way of life. Well, this, of course, occurred in the backdrop of larger issues that were going on, essentially the failure of American foreign policy, which was creating a refugee crisis in the Middle East. So essentially what you got going on was America's shenanigans in the Middle East had created this disastrous situation whereby there was heavy amounts of instability in these Middle Eastern countries, specifically in Iraq, but also in Syria as well, where you had these large masses of people that have been displaced by the failures of Bush's and Obama's policies in the Middle East. And many of them, of course, ended up joining what was called the Islamic State, aka ISIS, which was a group that had heavy ties to the CIA. It had heavy ties to, it was very much an astroturfed group that was, if not created by the West, certainly heavily promoted by the West as a means of driving a wedge in the Middle East and causing more conflict and more chaos. And out of this mess, what you ended up with was a major refugee crisis where huge numbers of people were being displaced and they were going to European nations, and they were also coming to America. And the result of this was that there was a huge controversy over what should be done with these refugees. And it led to really the growth of the far right in both Europe and in America, that now there was this new far-right nationalism that defined itself in opposition to these refugees. And Donald Trump was basically riding on a wave of that far-right nationalism. And that his perspective, his understanding was, we've got this situation that could rapidly go out of our control. So I'm going to be the controlled opposition. I'm going to basically turn this into an opportunity to have like quasi-ethnic or certainly civic nationalism. And I'm going to toot the horn of America first and the inability of people from the Middle East and also people from Mexico to assimilate. And I'm going to base my entire campaign off of that, off of this like culture war issue over demographics, over immigration. And of course, that ended up dividing the country even further. Then Trump becomes president. There's a brief moratorium on immigration from these Islamic countries that lasts for just a few weeks, but there's no serious attempt to stop the general tide of immigration. And so what ends up actually happening is that this more becomes a wedge issue that further divides the American public. Now, the way that a lot of Trump supporters like to portray the situation is that it's one of essentially a working class populist group versus these coastal elites, right? These people on the West Coast, these people on the East Coast, these people in New York City and LA and Chicago and the major cities like that are out of touch, that are suburbanized, that are, they're enforcing all this crap on the working class, but they themselves are living in their nice little fancy houses and their nice little fancy neighborhoods, allowing everybody else to suffer while they get rich off the backs of the suffering of the working class. And there's a lot of truth in that. I'm not saying that Trump was necessarily wrong in a lot of what he said. There's a lot of truth in that. But the issue is that when you really look down and into it, that there was a large degree to which there's just smoke and mirrors. And that really what the Republican base still is today is essentially the same groups of people that it was 20 years ago when it was the neocons that were pushing for blowing up the Middle East and turning the Middle East into a parking lot and all this other basically pro-genocide bullshit, all this other imperialist colonialist bullshit that we saw back in the Bush era that never really went away. It got sublimated to some extent, but never went away. So what this study, the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, indicates is that when you look at it, the stats are out there that on the vast majority of measures related to interventionism in the Middle East, of course, the question were only asked about the Middle East because that was the main area of unrest back in 2016. What they found was that Donald Trump supporters were significantly more likely than Hillary Clinton supporters, and far more likely than Bernie Sanders supporters to be in favor of neoconservative intervention. So if you look at an issue like, say, they asked about whether or not there should be...
Oh, yeah, I could bring up that data on screen as well.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll do that really quick while you're talking.
So, say the issue is, I don't know, say the issue is, should we take a stand? Should we, send troops to Syria or Iraq in order to stop ISIS? Well, there's a large body of evidence that Trump supporters, generally speaking, would have said yes. That Trump supporters would have held the interventionist, militaristic, nationalistic position in 2016. Just, 2016, of course, being significantly before today, there's been a lot of change. And I know people would say, well, maybe this is outdated data. And nowadays in the era of Russia, Ukraine, maybe things would be different. I'm not so convinced because, at the same time, this wasn't that long ago. So here we have the Iran Sanctions Act. This, of course, was an act of Congress that was quite popular with the American public. As you can see, 84% of voters. Now, again, this is voters, non-voters were significantly more cynical about this, but but among people who did vote, 84% of them basically, I would say, took the cocked position on this, basically saying that like we ought to support placing sanctions on Iran for not going along with the unipolar New World Order agenda. But it was over 90% of Trump supporters. Keep in mind, like 90% was about the highest that you got for like Republicans in the Iraq War era. About 90% of Republicans at the very height of the Iraq War fervor supported the Iraq War. So this indicates that was basically a monolithic tendency towards interventionism. Over here, you see, should the U.S. military intervene in terms of destroying terrorist camps? This one is slightly less popular with voters as a whole. Again, non-voters are significantly less interventionist than voters, but this is only talking about voters. Still, over 80% of Donald Trump supporters are in favor of using military intervention in order to stop terrorism, the war on terror, basically. So the war on terror was still alive and well in 2016. And by the way, now, look at these statistics. It makes sense because what's one of the big right-wing talking points today is like whining about Biden because of his policy in Afghanistan, which is, to me, that's like the best thing that Biden did as president was pull out of Afghanistan. But so many of these like neocons that are pretending that they're Christian nationalists or whatever, they like whine about the way Biden handled the pulling out of Afghanistan was so bad. Like, no, it was essentially it's going to be bad if you're a jingoist for the Western system. But the Western system is itself a problem. Here we have using drones and aircraft to bomb ISIS troops. So this is saying that like we should have drone strikes on. This is basically supporting Obama's policy of doing drone strikes at weddings and funerals, because people are accused of having ties to ISIS. Not all the accusations, by the way, are substantiated. It becomes a form of modern McCarthyism. And this is my favorite one: send significant force to fight ISIS. So should we just straight up invade and start more stupid ass war in the Middle East? Well, the majority of Trump supporters say yes. This is a huge gap here. 14% of Hillary Clinton supporters. 14%, 86% of Hillary Clinton's supporters took the correct position on whether or not we should start more garbage wars in the Middle East. More than half of Trump supporters believe we should start more garbage wars in the Middle East. These guys are neocons. These guys are interventionist neocons. And by the way, Trump himself was an interventionist neocon. We saw that with the fact that he did all these strikes against Syria after he became president. We saw what he did with assassinating that Suleiman guy.
Soleimani.
And his simps came out to defend all that. His simps like Nick Fuentes came out to say that if you're against what happened to Suleiman in Iran, if you're against Trump basically trying to manufacture a really seriously bad global situation that could have taken us to war with Iran, if you speak out against that, then you're a woke liberal, you're crazy, or you hate our democracy, which is like literally a fucking liberal talking point. Oh, you're trying to subvert our democracy. But then that's literally what all the like right-wingers said when people started having principled basic critiques of the idea of courting war with Iran. And I have no doubt that the only reason right now why these people on the right that just 4 years ago, were promoting this crap, were promoting what happened in Iran with Suleiman, were promoting these airstrikes in Syria, were saying just 6 years ago or 7 years ago that the majority of them were saying we need to invade the Middle East in order to stop ISIS. These people, I have no doubt that if it were not for the fact that Biden were president, they would be pushing for this crap right now. The only reason why they're trying to like LARP as paleocons right now is because right now they're in a situation, they're in a geopolitical situation where they can portray Biden as an out of control interventionist that's spending all this money on Ukraine and is refusing to go along with peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And they can make this LARP argument that, see, we're actually the anti-interventionists because we think Biden is being an idiot because he's prolonging this conflict in Eastern Europe and all that. But the reality is that they're only doing that because Biden's president. If Trump were president and all this were happening, then they would completely be on the side of no, you need to go hard. You need to be completely it's non-negotiable. Russia's the enemy, all that. I have no doubt about that. I have no doubt that if it were a situation where the right was the one that was in charge while all this was going on, they would react the way that they always have because they're always interventionist neocons. When's the last time conservatives were not interventionist? The last time Republicans were not interventionist neocons was before 1945. It was during the isolationist era of the 1920s and 1930s, which is also when Republicans were basically the liberal party, because people forget about this. Republicans, during the period when they were non-interventionists, they were essentially, during the 1920s, during the Calvin Coolidge era, they were essentially the liberal party. They were the ones that were pushing for women's suffrage. They were the ones that were pushing for the progressive social reforms. It was the Democrats, who were the conservative party back then, the ones that represented, rural Southern rednecks at the time, were the Democrats, and they were the ones that were pro-interventionist. So you have to go back, basically, if you want to go back to a time when so-called conservatism was not just imperialism, you would have to go back to a time when the so-called conservative party was actually the liberal party, because there's never been a time when American conservatives haven't just pushed as hard as they could in favor of getting themselves involved in other people's business. It goes back to the fact that American conservatism at its outset was a movement created by Freemasons like Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republicans, or the Anti-Federalists, the conservative wing to some extent, although to some extent you could also argue he was the radical left. But, these are useless terms anyway. But this small government wing of the American political establishment, they always were in favor of internationalism. They were always the ones that were pushing for, free trade with other countries. They were always the ones that were pushing for essentially an America last economic policy and an America last foreign policy. You saw this during the Mexican War. During the Mexican War, it was the Southern rednecks that were pushing hard for intervention, or pushing hard for, we need Texas or else we're going to secede and all this bullshit, where they literally were putting pressure on the Northerners to basically push them into a war that a lot of them didn't want. You saw this later on during the Civil War. It was the people that were agitating for war were the Southerners, were the Southern conservatives, the right wingers. It was the Northerners that were trying to avoid war. It was the Northerners that were trying to do whatever they could. Abraham Lincoln had no desire to have the Civil War. He wanted, as far as he was concerned, it was a last resort, and he only declared war. He took a while. When South Carolina seceded, he was like, we're not going to declare war on South Carolina. It was only when a bunch of other states joined them that he was finally forced to, okay, we're going to have to preserve the Union somehow. But Abraham Lincoln, who was, of course, who represented the more liberal side, he was the anti-war candidate. And the people that were pushing hard for war were these conservative right-wingers in the South. This has always been an issue. This has always been the way that things have gone throughout American history, is that essentially the movements that are now what we call the modern right or the modern Christian nationalist movement. They've always been imperialist. They've always been militarist. They've always been nationalistic. They've always tried to dip their fingers in everybody else's business. The evangelicals and the fundamentalists have never been able to live at peace with anybody that's not an evangelical and a fundamentalist. You can see this even with what the annexation of Hawaii, which was accomplished because a bunch of fundamentalist Calvinists agitated for it and were not willing to allow the Hawaiians to have any say, because in their view, the Hawaiians were these like evil pagan demon worshipers who were all going to hell. And so they needed to, they used this religiosity, they used their fundamentalism as a springboard in order to justify what was essentially a geopolitical conquest of a nation that led to the mass destruction of the native peoples and the creation of the modern state of Hawaii, which has very little to do with what Hawaii was for thousands of years. So you see, this is a very, very ancient, you say not ancient, but like, a very old strategy, a very old and very negative, I would say, trend within American society, that you have this movement that keeps on pretending that it's just about peace and love and Christianity, and it's just wonderful. And of course, you're going to support us because we're the good guys and we're the ones that are saving you from, stupid liberal SJWs or whatever. But like, when you really look into it, it always takes this form because it's always run by the Christian right. It's always run by these evangelicals, these fundamentalists. As a result, it takes the form of this messianic cult that is essentially anal retentive and wants to push everybody else down its slide into Kali Yuga. It wants to push everybody else down with it. You saw this with QAnon. You saw this with all these like fundamentalist movements that idolize Trump. They essentially see Trump as a messianic figure, which is very much what they did with somebody like George W. Bush. They saw George W. Bush as a messianic figure, and they saw the war in Iraq as a crusade. Going back to Reagan, they saw Reagan as a messianic figure who's going to bring an end to the communist evil empire. Going back further than that, they saw, people like Teddy Roosevelt as messianic figures. Teddy Roosevelt, who famously said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." In other words, essentially, when you're doing your diplomacy, try to seek for the diplomatic solution, but let everybody else know that you're willing to punch down. You're willing to bully the lesser nations of the world, the places like Cuba, which of course was annexed by America under William McKinley, who was the president when Teddy Roosevelt was the vice president. Places like the Philippines, which was also annexed by America when William McKinley was president. All these places, all these nations that were added to the American empire, and it was largely the evangelicals and the fundamentalist Christians that were in favor of this manifest destiny, the idea that we should massacre Native Americans. We should, because God has given us a special mission to go out west and conquer the West. It was a bizarre mixture of Horace Greeley's, purely secular, purely monetary, fiscal push for Western expansion with Christian fundamentalism saying, like, if we really are the shining light on the hill that the occultist scumbag John Winthrop described America as being, then we should have a right to expand from sea to shining sea, and we need to push out all these savages that are lying in our way. They're not one of us. They don't have the superior, Indo-European phenotype, and they're not Christians, so they just belong to the dustbin of history. But we have a manifest destiny from God to expand out west. It was this very same imperialistic mindset that was pushed by these very same people. It's like this Christian nationalism is nothing new. It's a very old movement, and what it always ends up leading to is basically it becomes a springboard for abusive bullies with power fantasies to go and practice their power fantasies and live out their power fantasies in such a way that ordinary people end up suffering. And of course, the reason why this is because of the fact that now I have not actually shared this with our host, so I might put this in the private chat, but if you look, I'm just going to do this over the course of the next little bit. If you look at this, mainstream politics is based around this dialectic, this false dialectic of the hold on a second. It's based on this false dialectic of the conservative evangelical Christian versus like the liberal atheist, which is silly because even, despite all the astroturf and all the pushing of atheism, it's still a very small percentage of the American population. I know that they have a huge predominance online, but only about 4 to 5% of Americans, even now in the 2020s, are atheists. Now, Pew Research and others have done interesting studies on what's happened during this era of so-called secularization. And this, of course, is the popular narrative, right? Is that we're undergoing secularization, religiosity is declining in the world, atheism is taking over, and of course, this is what the secular humanists and the atheists themselves are pushing, is this narrative of religion is dying. We're now living in a glorious age of science and allopathy, and science is solving all our problems, and AI is going to liberate us, and technology is going to liberate us, and modern big pharma bullshit is going to liberate us from the savagery of the past. And it's inevitable, and we're entering this glorious new age where the mystical and the metaphysical, they all die off. This actually brings us to, what we saw recently with Mr. Haas of Infrared in his debate with Jay Dyer, which was a total embarrassment on Jay Dyer's part. But, it's interesting because he was giving this very spirited critique of metaphysics, and although he's doing it from essentially this like fourth positionist, quasi-Duginist perspective of MAGA communism, the very same sorts of critiques are being given by the sort of the typical liberal, neoliberal, new atheist types like Matt Dillahunty, like Aaron Ra, like Sam Harris. They'll say basically essentially the same thing, that metaphysics is this thing that belongs to the dustbin of history. This is the past. This is like stupid people. They haven't adjusted to the times and realized that science has disproven all this. Well, the reality is that that's actually a mindset they inherited from an overly rationalistic brand of Christianity, which grew up during the Enlightenment. And that overly rationalistic brand of Christianity actually arose out of the enthusiastic brand of fundamentalist Christianity, which denied the spirit world. It said that everything spiritual is either fake or demonic. It was these Puritans, it was these Protestant fundamentalists that started introducing this idea that the sort of animistic realities that we'd always lived under ever since our hunter-gatherer age, even into the Middle Ages, that all this was, if not demonic, which they believed it to some extent was, at the very least was just fake pseudoscientific bullshit. And you got all these high-ranking university professors that went around debunking any evidence of what you could call like psychic phenomena, extrasensory perception, ghosts, astrology, horoscopes, all these things that have been taken for granted for thousands of years within basically all world religions. And all of a sudden this comes under attack in the West because of these Protestant fundamentalists. And then it comes under attack via these like deistic liberal Christians in the 18th century. And then it comes under the attack from the atheist agnostics that come out of this deistic liberal Christianity after that. Well, this is where you get the secularization thesis coming out of. The secularization thesis promotes this idea that, we are becoming more and more this liberal Whiggish dream, that we're overcoming superstition, we're replacing it with science. This is the classic Whig history idea. The Victorian era was we began with this ooga booga magic stuff, right? This magic superstition stuff. Then magic gave way to religion, and then religion is going to give way to science, and we're now going to live in this glorious era of secular humanism where we no longer have to, fall back on this like silly superstitious stuff called religion anymore. Well, the problem is if you actually look at the data out there, that's not what's happening. We're not entering this glorious new secularization era of scientism. In fact, we appear to be entering what the hippies of the 1960s called the age of Aquarius, because it would appear that these animistic beliefs that were so long suppressed are returning. And that the return of animism, although it's quiet and it's not spoken about and it's not, it won't get you big like news spots. It won't get you recognition the way that talking about secularization, the lie of secularization in the West will, telling the truth about reanimization, telling the truth about like, hey, maybe there's some truth in this Aquarius idea that we're heading into this new era of spiritual awareness via rediscovering traditional indigenous animistic or ancestral understandings of a living universe imbued with spirit, imbued with consciousness. That's not something that's going to be supported. That's not something that the media is going to want to talk about. And yet the differences are stark. In the 1960s, the early 1960s, before the hippies came about, we had essentially we had surveys out there, surveys by groups like Gallup, saying that religion, it was almost totally extrinsic. Religion was almost totally extrinsic. It was completely just, you go to church because you're a good citizen, and a good citizen goes to church. But essentially, that's what religion is. And you believe in God, but you disbelieve in the spirit world. You disbelieve in extrasensory perception. You disbelieve in the notion that there are spiritual forces that are guiding everything, because that stuff's a silly superstition, and science has done away with all that. And you disbelieve in holistic medicine because that stuff is just quackery, and everybody knows that allopathic big pharma bullshit is really what's going to bring us into the greatest time that in human history, which is now. That was the mindset of the 1950s and the early 1960s. Well, now that's been totally eroded. Now, if you look at surveys now, so it was about 20% of people had mystical experiences in the 1960s. It's more than 50% now. You get huge percentage of the population now will speak about having experiences where they interact with the ghosts of the dead, where they interact with various other spiritual entities, where they have out-of-body experiences, where they have a sixth sense, where they have psychic dreams and psychic vision. Like, all this stuff has gone way up. People are actually much more mystically oriented now than they were 50 or 60 years ago. And of course, the media is not going to report on this because this isn't what's supposed to happen. This is not supposed to happen. Science is supposed to come in and supposed to obviate the need for all this ooga booga crazy superstitious stuff, all this crazy pseudoscientific astrology, and all this, weird like animistic bullshit from our violent, terrible hunter-gatherer past. But that's not what's actually happening. What seems to be happening is that people in general are rediscovering this, and they're actually using this to push back on the establishment. You see a declining percentage of people that are using allopathic medicine, particularly the youth. What's the stereotype that they're trying to push in the media of a person that's against, getting the jibby jab, is that there's some like right-wing boomer with the MAGA hat. No, actually, if you look at the statistics, the people that are like that are overwhelmingly under the age of 40. They're overwhelmingly millennials and Gen Zs that in many cases are actually quite socially progressive. They'll if you ask them what their opinions on social issues are, they will not necessarily default to the MAGA position. But they're critical of allopathic medicine, because let's face it, allopathic medicine has caused a lot of problems, and there's a lot of valid critiques that you can give of it.
Can I interject really quick?
Sure. Yes.
So when you're bringing up like that about magical experiences versus like modern science, there was actually a really interesting movie that Rankin Bass did called The Flight of Dragons, and the whole plot of that movie is how magic was disappearing because of modern science. And then of course, like the crazy part about it is at the end of the movie, the main character kills the evil wizard because the evil wizard is the last one trying to hold on to magic compared to the other wizards, but the evil wizard gets killed because the main character starts spouting off a bunch of scientific facts and kills him with science.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing. Like that was the bullshit narrative back at the time. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
because
this
that
is
was
why.
from the early 80s.
Well, I mean, because this is why the hippies got such bad press, is because the hippies threatened this establishment because they were trying to reinterject the metaphysical into a world where religion and spirituality had become bland. And it was, I mean, it was very, um, it was very much like, I don't even blame, like, I almost don't blame people for becoming atheists if they were raised in like a certain generation during, you know, the 80s and 90s or even 70s, because the religion at the time was so bland and so pathetic and so clearly did not, you know, was not satisfying. I mean, I grew up in essentially like a sort of like quasi liberal, quasi conservative Catholic, like white Catholic environment. Very different, of course, from, you know, I'm not throwing all Catholics under the bus. Obviously, you know, if you look at like Hispanic Catholics, they're not like this. But I grew up in this environment whereby, you know, essentially religion was so devoid of the meaning that it had been imbued with for the majority of human history that it's really, I mean, it's really hard to stay a believer in God if the God that you're taught to believe in is basically just this rationalistic entity, this entity that exists purely in the intellect, that propels a bunch of bourgeois social climbers to go to church in order to prove how moral they are. Like that's going to lead people to reject religion. And it led me to reject religion. You know, 10 years ago, I didn't believe in God. And it was, the reality is that, like, it's that sort of garbage excuse for spirituality that's causing so much of our crisis. And it's what's causing these younger people that finally, I think, can't stand it anymore, to push basically back towards the old animism. Like I mean, I see this with Gen Z. You know, I'm a teacher. I see with Gen Z, it's like they're so fascinated by astrology, by horoscopes. You know, I didn't see this with anybody when I was a kid. I know that there's the stereotype that maybe back in the 60s, you know, all these hippies were like that, but like I didn't see anything like that when I was growing up with either older or younger people. But I see this now with, like, you know, teenagers, is that they're very fascinated by these metaphysical ideas. And the reason why they're getting into these metaphysical ideas is because on a certain level, they realize that the boomer rationalism, the like boomer religion, has failed them. And atheism is part of that. Atheism is part of that age of Pisces BS. Atheism is part of that system that's essentially fooled them. And so is Christian evangelical fundamentalism. So are these Protestant fundamentalists. Like, you look at, there's another study by Pew Research, it might be the same one that I shared just now, that's saying that, you know, atheists, that the two groups that stand out in terms of their opposition to these sort of deeper metaphysical realities, the two groups that stand out are atheists and evangelical Protestants. You know, you look at like the Catholics and the mainline Protestants and the I don't know, like, and the spiritual but not religious or whatever, or Jews or what, like whatever other group you want to throw in there, and a very high percentage of them are open to spirituality. The groups that are the most anti-spirituality are the extrinsically religious, aka the evangelicals and the fundamentalists, or the outright irreligious, the secular humanists and the atheists. And by the way, and these are this is outdated information. What you're seeing right now, this is information from the late 2000s, saying 25% of people believe in reincarnation. It's now up to about a third. So now about a third of people believe in reincarnation, including almost half of Gen Z. It says here, astrology, belief in astrology has also gone up. Spiritual energy located in physical things. This one has gone up substantially. Let me see if I can find the documentation of this. It's gone up from 26%, which it was in 2009, to almost 40%. So almost 40% of people in, I believe, 2018 believe in a form of panentheism, which is the basic background of what human beings across the world have believed for hundreds of thousands of years. You know, you look and you see this panentheistic belief, this belief that spirit is located within everything, this belief that God could be found within all things. That is a belief that you could find with the Aborigines, you can find it with African tribes, you can find it with Native Americans, you can find it with Siberians, you can find it with East Asian, Southeast Asian hill tribes in Zomia. You can find it even within, Europeans a few hundred years ago took this for granted. You can arguably find this within even certain interpretations of the world religions. You can find this within Sufism and Islam. You can find this within Orthodox Christianity to some extent with the Doctrine of the Divine Energies and with St. Maximus's Logos theology. All these seem to be very open to an animistic interpretation of the world. But of course, modern Protestantizing Christianity has decided that that stuff's all bad and we should suppress that notion. And for a while, they were doing a pretty good job of it. And even in 2009, only about 26% of people said that they believed essentially in an animistic, panentheistic understanding. But now, and I'm going to share this also in the private chat. Now what we're seeing is that as of 2018, the percentage has gone way up. 42% of Americans are now animists. 41% say they believe in psychics. 33% believe in reincarnation. 29% believe in astrology. This has been there's been a rapid growth in these sort of paranormal, animistic, spiritualistic beliefs that in many cases, atheism has been dwarfed by these trends. And of course, people aren't talking about these trends because this is an inconvenient truth. It's just like people don't want to talk about the decline in trust in allopathic medicine. People don't want to talk about the fact that the very same organization, Pew Research, says that now only half of Americans actually believe that modern medicine allows us to live longer, better lives. So the dogma that things are getting better because allopathy and big pharma are coming in saving the day, this is actually now a belief that's only held by about half of Americans. So there's being a huge degree to which this secular system of just trusting the science and trusting these, atheist bugmen and lab coats, like this is actually coming very much under attack. It seems as though this idea that comes out of the age of Pisces itself, this idea of scientific rationalism, this is not the wave of the future. This seems to be like the people that believe this appear to be on the wrong side of history. So here you go. 42% of people says 6 in 10 Christians hold at least one New Age belief. 42% believe that spiritual energy can be located in physical things. 41% say they believe in psychics. And by the way, you notice that even people that are not religious, so even people that say they're not religious, unless they're outright atheists, they tend to be open to the metaphysical reality. Agnostics, 40% of agnostics are animists. That's about the same as the percentage of people in general. The most animistic group in America are the spiritual but not religious. That's 61% of people that are spiritual but not religious are animists. Even Christians, 37% of Christians are animists. Evangelicals and atheists stand out. Even 24% of evangelicals and even 13% of atheists believe in animism, but they're the groups that tend to stand out. They're the groups that tend to stand out as being the most willing to still cling on to this older system that really in many ways is robbing people of understanding this deeper spirituality. Is trying to keep everything within the domain of organized religion. And the more you try to make religion standardized and organized, the more you actually do a disservice to spirituality, and the more you actually push people away from it, which is why so many of these evangelical youth are apostatizing now to atheism, because they don't have a better alternative. They're not given this alternative that they maybe would have been given if we were a more healthy society. Now, this has a lot. Oh, what's up?
Oh, sorry. I heard you pause for a second, so I was just gonna like ask you something. So, yeah, these are some very interesting points because I know like my mother talks about the new age stuff a lot, but not more in like a critical level, just like as in like disdain and detestation because she thinks like all this stuff is just like satanic and everything. But there is some truth to that because like there's some truth to like the new age stuff infiltrating Christianity because you had like the power of positive thinking from Norman Vincent Peale that Pastor Rick Warren really ran off with when he did like the purpose driven life. And then you see that, with that megachurch preacher Joel Osteen.
Yeah, I mean they're appropriating certain ideas that essentially, I mean, really, and this is where I'm probably going to I might ruffle some feathers in the communities I hang out with by saying this, but I don't think that the new age is necessarily a bad thing. I think that the way it's commoditized is a bad thing. The way that it's become associated with like Oprah selling you a bunch of like stupid like that. I think that like that's not a good thing, obviously, but like I don't see how, like, personally, I don't like, I'm not saying this, I'm usually pretty black pilled, but I'm not like saying this like as a black pilled, like downer, Debbie Downer, like, oh my God, the new age is taking, like, I'm saying that this is actually, I would argue is a positive development in that people are essentially have decided that they've had it with this ersatz relatively new idea of spirituality, and they want to go back to being the way that things were for thousands and thousands of years. Because the new age, what really the core of the new age, I'm not talking about the bullshit that's in the new age, because there's a lot of bullshit in it too, but like the core of what the new age seeks to do is it actually seeks to go back to the old age. It actually, like, these ideas are ideas that were pretty much taken for granted up until the Enlightenment. I mean, a lot of people don't want to recognize this, but Thomas Aquinas basically believed in pretty much everything that the New Age believed in. He believed in crystal healing. He believed in astrology. He believed in all this stuff. The people of the time, most people at the time, like people in general during the Middle Ages, had still largely an animistic, spiritualistic belief, as did their people in the ancient world, as did obviously everybody in the hunter-gatherer world. There's this largely unbroken continuum up until the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment breaks that continuum and creates a watered-down, tepid version of religion that doesn't appeal to people, and as a result, they can only stand so much of it, and then they rebel, and that's how you ended up with what you have now, where people basically are not actually really, I wouldn't even say that people are more secular now than they were in the past. Simply what it more actually is that they're less willing to contend themselves to a phony ersatz extrinsic understanding of religion. That organized religion is in peril, but spirituality is not. Spirituality appears to be thriving. I don't know if you have anything you want to comment on.
Oh, I do. But it's more like it's more just like generalized on the topic we're talking about as well, because For example, we're both kind of fall more in the traditionalist camp. And one thing that I know that we were talking about before the stream is how a lot of these people on the right are, it's mainly on the tradcath, ortho bro, and sometimes even a few dissident right people are really in love with the vaporwave or synthwave aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, essentially the problem with traditionalism is that it amounts to a romanticization of a past that is never coming back, that was never there to begin with. Vaporwave is just, let's idealize the 1980s, which is a time when the vast majority of these guys were not around during. It is essentially, let's cobble together some things that we like from the 80s that we didn't actually remember. Well, the reality is that nobody that had the views that the average orthobro would have been comfortable in the 80s, because during the 80s, the Orthodox Church was a disaster where the majority of it was being suppressed by communism. And beyond that, America was completely under the thumb of the Christian right as well. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to live in the 80s and be told that if I played Dungeons and Dragons, I was going to hell and all this other stupid bullshit because making all that crap.
Yeah, because they used to write books in the 80s about how evil the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, people romanticize the past, but the 80s were a time of it was the zeitgeist of the culture was pretty much in the hands of these crazy fundamentalists. I don't want to go back to that crap.
Right. And Gen X Jeff makes a good point about synthwave. I can't believe that's the new aesthetic for the orthobro cult.
Yeah, I mean, it's was historically illiterate because, what did people say about synth during the 80s? They used to call it back at the time. They used to call it art F slur music. That was the term for it. It was not this based trad conservative thing. It was this thing that was basically, it was like punk. It was like the rebels. It was like the radical left. Basically, it was their form of rebellion against the right-wing zeitgeist at the time.
Yeah, that's very true because a lot of synth pop from the 80s was very leftist oriented. And none of it was conservative, by the way. I mean, not a single one of them. I mean, you had you remember the Human League because they had an offshoot group called Heaven 17. And the first song on that album is We Don't Need This Fascist Groove Thing, which is an anti-fascist anthem. That's not what no conservative would be singing about.
Yeah, I mean, well, then that's the thing. Again, these people, they don't understand the actual they don't understand the history. They just are going based on, it's all about aesthetics. And this is the problem with this, to a large degree, with these YouTubes and these online communities, is that they siphon people off into these little echo chambers where it all becomes essentially about just the creation of this narrative. It's invented traditions, as they used to talk about. What's the guy's name? I think Alan Dundes, the great anthropologist, talks about this, about invented traditions, about these ideas, these traditions that we have, that we think are somehow, that we create, that we think are somehow real. But in a consumerist, modern sort of economy, they're not really real at all. They're just manufactured, and they're just manufactured specifically for their little echo chambers. And the orthobros, they have their little echo chamber, and the Christian nationalists, they have their little echo chamber, and they create their own false reality with their own silly little ideas that are really don't have anything to do with the way things actually are or were.
Yeah, this is an example of what synth pop artists would look like in the 80s. This is Depeche Mode. They were huge during that decade. I mean, I like Depeche Mode, but I mean, I wouldn't. There's nothing conservative about their music. I mean, blasphemous rumors where they're talking about where they think God has a sick sense of humor. A lot. There was a documentary in the '80s called "Hell's Bells: The Dangers of Rock and Roll," and they mentioned that song, talking about how dangerous and subversive music like that was, to Christians at the time.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like these people, they don't think about this because they don't actually study the stuff. They just think like, I mean, I honestly think a lot of them are at the level, and I didn't think this when I first started, listening to like orthopro content, but as I've got to know them better, I honestly think that there's a number of them, especially the younger ones, that literally think like, well, the 80s were like based because Ronald Reagan was president or some bullshit like that. Like
Yeah.
it's that.
One, it was funny too because like in the early half of the '80s, you had these slasher movies, and I have like this really interesting book of critical theory called "Preposterous Violence." But anyways, during the mid '80s, you started having heavy censorship of those movies. So you go from the beginning of the decade where you see blood and gore to like the end of the decade where when Jason slashes someone, there's no blood. By the '86 or whatever. When they had that sixth Friday the 13th movie. It was also a
Oh,
time where a lot of people, yeah,
well, that's interesting because I know that there was like heavy, I guess you could call it censorship of cartoons during the 80s, right? Because like during the early
there was.
80s, you got like, He-Man and beating people up, but then eventually it was like, no, you're not supposed to do that. So now we have to have like a bunch of Care Bears, sappy crap.
Well, see, in the '80s, it was the norm to do like PSAs and cartoons. So, like, He-Man did that, GI Joe did that, Transformers did that, and it wasn't until the very end of the decade that you started getting shows like the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse. But then that got canceled because people were freaking out over him sniffing a flower and getting strength from it because they thought it was promoting drug use.
Oh, I saw that episode, like, not at the time because I wasn't born yet, but like I saw years later, I saw that episode. It was hilarious. It was like I almost actually think that it might have been a drug reference just because Ralph Bakshi is such a troll. Like
Right.
I think there's a chance that he did do that on purpose just because he was just trying to piss people off. Like it was very gratuitous. Random question: what do you think were some overrated decades? All of them. Like I think that like there's a tendency to nostalgia, and I understand, because I do the same thing, right? I was a kid in the 90s, and I have these rose tinted glasses about like, man, everything was so awesome when I used to like, we used to have the Nickelodeon in the 90s. It was so great.
Right.
We had all the fucking whatever, Brocco's Modern Life and all that. But like the reality is that like all these decades, they all have essentially cultural rot that we just forget about. So you get people that romanticize the 60s and say like, oh, the 60s were so great because they had all the hippies and stuff. And, and there's positive things about that. There's positive things about the 60s counterculture. Absolutely. But people also forget about the fact that, that was also the decade when people that had, conscientious objectors in Kent, Ohio were gunned down by the police. And half the community said, well, the only problem was that the police didn't shoot more of them. It was a time which was extremely harsh when you lived through it. It was basically a lot like now with the polarization and the culture wars. 70s, okay, yeah, you get all these like Forrest Gump and all these movies that romanticize the 70s and how great the 70s were. But again, the economy was crap for the majority of the decade, and people were very pessimistic. It looked like the Soviets were winning the Cold War, and by the end of the decade, you had this idiot Jimmy Carter running everything, who was a fundamentalist, and you had this like mass. I mean, that's really where all the like fundamentalist crap started. 80s, we've covered all the problems with the 80s. You go to the 90s. That's the decade when I grew up during the 90s, and it was, again, for me it seemed like it was awesome. Like, wow, the 90s were great. They had all the like these awesome cartoons. They had all these awesome, like you could just.
But that was the problem with the 90s. It's like there was a lot of good media that decade, but it kind of blinded people to what was really going on, because that was like the age of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. So Fukuyama was like, oh, we're at the end of history. We're going to reach this liberal utopian age. Nothing's going to really mess anything up, and we're just going to keep marching forward. And that's what I believed too as a kid. I thought like, oh, we are in this free country. Everything's going forward. What can possibly go wrong? And here we are in 2023, and we see a lot going wrong.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, people didn't realize, like, everybody made this gamble on neoliberalism because it seemed to be working for a short time. But even in the 90s, I mean, like the zeitgeist of the 90s, if you were not, a punky little kid like me, just absorbing media, thinking that like the coolest thing ever was freaking baby bottle pops. If you weren't that, you were I mean, what was to me the number one show, the number one TV series that best captured the 90s was Daria, because it was essentially a representation of a world where people were shallow and they were status seeking, and they were like, it was basically the capitalist system. It was about a person, Daria Morgendorffer, who was trapped in this horrible, shallow, materialistic world that was completely just all about enriching itself. This was the era of was that TV show Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. That was like one of the big popular shows during the 90s. And it was this completely materialistic world that, if you were a critical thinker, then you were going to become cynical and disillusioned and angry at the world. And, and this is, I think, the genius. This is why even to this day, a lot of people say that, Daria was one of the greatest TV shows ever made, is because it perfectly captured this. It perfectly captured what it was like to be a Gen Xer living at this time, living at a time when essentially we were surrounded by these fools. And if you had any degree of deep thinking, you were a social pariah. There was something wrong with you. If you weren't like, you had two options in the 90s, essentially. You could be either like the most shallow, superficial valley girl, or you could be the most obnoxious, fratty dude bro. And if you didn't fall into one of those two, then there was something wrong with you.
Right. Well, and another thing that was interesting, speaking on American contradictions, is like when you were on that stream yesterday, where they were showing like the Aztecs and saying, oh, was this better than what we got now? You said it was equal to what we have now, because of the utter lack of regard for human life that we're seeing, especially like in big cities.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, we don't see, like, when was the last time that we really saw any sense to which there was intrinsic value to humanity? Because I don't think that people think that now. I don't think that, I mean, especially not in this age of polarization, people seem to think that the other party, the other political party from theirs is like the devil. I mean, like, you look at these studies that are out that are literally saying that, like, for the average Republican or the average Democrat to find out that their child is dating somebody of the other party is like finding out in the 1950s that your child is dating somebody of another race. It's like, it's ridiculous.
Oh yeah, because like even when Madonna did that music video for Like a Prayer, it was considered really controversial for her at the time to be having a romance scene with a black man. And I mean, that's just like how far we've gotten from there to now, because like when you talk about like political polarization, that's the equivalent of that, but even worse, because there was a time when Republicans, for example, were against, mixed marriages.
Well, now they're against mixed marriages. They're against marriages with Democrats. Like, it's,
Yeah.
that's the thing. Like, like if you look at it, essentially what they're saying now, like, is, you're not allowed to fraternize with the other side. We've got this tribalism going on, and it's stupid because all the stuff is there to do is to divide people, and so many of the division, they're ersatz. They're not really, like, that's the other thing that comes out in these surveys that I've been looking at, is that, like, yeah, there's a huge gap between what people think on any given issue, but like that's because they're just not actually looking at what the other side has to say. Like why can't we just look? And you know what? I'm not saying like, oh, just all be kumbaya and say like everybody that's what the other party as you are, just like come and embrace them peacefully and everything to be awesome. Like, yeah, obviously there's like stupid bullshit that are in the platforms of both parties. But the reality at the same time is that if you understand where the other side comes from, and this is a point I made for years, if you understand where the other side comes from, you could actually make a more convincing case for your side. I've been telling people that are like anti-woke and stuff this for quite a while, that like, understand why people become woke instead of just screeching about the fact that they are woke. And you'll actually
exactly. Read their books and have good faith dialogue. But see, it's funny because Dr. Seuss wrote this book that I'm showing right here during the height of the Cold War, I think in the 80s. And this was one of like close to one of his last books. And the crazy thing about this book is, speaking of political polarization, this book is about these two people that look exactly the same, but they're on opposing side because they're on opposing teams, because one side puts their butter on top of the toast and the other side puts their butter on the bottom of the toast. And because they have a disagreement about it, they keep creating different weapons to kill each other. And then at the very end of the book, they create this bomb that could basically wipe out all life on either side. And the book ends right there with before they drop it on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, and that's and you know what? I actually have never even heard of that book before. I thought that the last thing Dr. Seuss wrote was the Lorax, or what was the other book? The book that everybody has for their graduation, The Places You'll Go, right? I thought that was the last one he ever written. But no, like the so I'd never even heard of that. But that to me, that sounds about right. That sounds about right.
Because we mentioned Bakshi earlier, and Bakshi actually animated the special for it. I'll have to send you a link to it after the show, so you can watch it on your spare time. But yeah, it's funny because it's about these two. It's just so stupid too, because it's like, oh, they put their butter on the top, we put it on the bottom. We don't like them, so we have to get violent. And then at the very end, it's a cliffhanger where like, hey, if they drop this thing, all life is gone. And I feel like that's sometimes the way Americans behave, because like all you got to do is like watch a world star hip hop video, or you see these videos of people just getting assaulted on the street and nobody like even flinches about it. They just kind of stare and gawk like they're watching, entertainment.
Well, it's fascinating. People did this experiment years ago where like they had these two people pretend to be a couple. And like basically the guy started like beating up his quote unquote girlfriend in public, and like everybody just sat there. It was just like they all just got embarrassed and like walked away from the situation. It was like they're so concerned about not losing face that they're not going to do anything in a situation like that. And this was not even that long ago. This was just within the last few years they did this experiment. I think they eventually found that like maybe out of 100 people, like maybe one person finally intervened, but the other 99 just, they got embarrassed by it and they walked away. And that's the mindset for so many people, is that they don't want to put themselves in another person's shoes. If they see something happening with another person, they see another person suffering, they're immediately just going to like, retreat back into their own shell. There's an interesting This reminds me of, obviously, I have a whole lot of problems with somebody like Theodore Adorno, but it's interesting because when he came up with his F scale test, one of the questions that he put on his test for determining whether you are a fascist or not was, when you see something troublesome happening, you shouldn't focus on it, but instead you should like forget about and think happy thoughts. And if you said yes, then you got a point for being a fascist, which I think is interesting. That like, but because there is some truth in the idea that like, so many people just end up allowing bad things to continue in society because it's like, just think happy thoughts and pretend that like the bad things aren't happening. To just like
Right.
don't face up to the harsh realities of life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just funny too because you have things like today, like drill music, for example, which is just songs about murder. And it's like, I know, like, cultures in the past weren't always like nonviolent, but it just the thought that somebody like, because I was joking to my girlfriend about this and she thought it was silly that like people would write songs about murder and the glorification of it.
Well, I mean, you look at these like 1990s era horrorcore rap music like that. I mean, that whole thing, that was just bizarre. It was like this bizarre celebration of sadism, and in the name of art. I mean, you could argue even something like, a lot of like the work of somebody like the Nine Inch Nails. It's just, again, it's like they could say, well, I mean, this is just artistic, but like at a certain point, if your songs consistently are dark and sadistic, then at a certain point, people are going to start questioning, like, is there something deeper going on here, right? Other than just you're being an artistic cynic.
Yeah, because like in the 90s, you had death metal rise in the 80s and early 90s. So in Europe, black metal became a big thing in like France and Norway, where you had like where they just thought, "Oh, these death metal guys are not serious enough. We got to take it to another level." And then you started having like stabbings, church burnings, um, and all sorts of crazy stuff going on because of it.
I mean, that was the era of Varg, who's now, a hero for a lot of people.
Yeah. It's pretty bad. And it's ridiculous because like when he was in trial, his reaction to his murder was just a smile.
Yeah, I mean, to this day, from what I understand, because he's like out and about now in the public, and to this day, he's basically, it's like he hasn't changed a bit. It's like 20 whatever years in prison he didn't think for a moment, and he's still like out there just promoting all his crap. Um,
Well,
the
I
door
mean,
underground.
I was gonna say to Jeff, like there was an old song that's like a standard now called Stagger Lee, and the story of that song is a guy just murdering someone after playing a card game, and that was from the 1920s.
Oh, I mean, you could see like there. I mean, there's this long tradition. I grew up in Appalachia. There's a long tradition in Appalachia, the murder ballad, like Tom Dooley and all these sorts of things. But the thing is that with the murder ballad, though, in its classic um, manifestation, it wasn't just a macabre fascination with death. It was a cautionary tale that says, don't be like these jackasses and get your act
Right.
together.
Yeah, true. It's like completely different. I mean, it's like the difference between watching a movie, like because when violent movies started appearing in the 60s, they were more like cautionary or just showing you the ugliness of humanity versus like, more modern entertainment where it's just like more sadistic and just more like, yeah, like we're just gonna like show as much graphic. It's not like, watching Hostel or something like that.
Or what was the human centipede? Like, yeah, I don't think there's anything that can be. I don't think there's anything cautionary about the human centipede. I think that's just torture porn.
Right. But yeah, because Saw started that whole genre of torture porn. And then that even ended up in cartoons where you had like, autistic cartoon reviewers whining about some episodes of SpongeBob being nothing but torture porn.
No, I mean there are some. It is kind of hard to dispute that. Having people's toenails randomly ripped off graphically in an episode of SpongeBob is probably not something you should put in a kids show.
Right. That's true. I mean, but even as a 90s kid, I mean, they put a lot of stuff in kids shows that weren't really necessarily for children, obviously, like Animaniacs, early episodes of Rugrats and
Yeah,
stuff of
see, but
that
I don't know.
nature.
Like at that time, though, that was cool because it was just like dirty jokes. I mean,
Mhm.
it was like yeah, like Rocko's Modern Life. Like every, I would say, I'm still to this day, I'm shocked that that show was allowed to exist. Like they had literally the name of their fast food restaurant was Choky Chicken.
Yeah. Or he called a sex hotline in one episode. And then there was another episode where a guy got his arms ripped off at a gym, and I could have sworn blood was like spurting out of his arms.
I
Oh,
don't
and
know.
then there
Maybe.
was it was a
Oh,
pretty graphic show too, because like there's one episode where a hammerhead shark baseball player has a ball just slam right into his eye, and then it comes out towards his other eye and stuff, and his eyeballs come out.
see, I mean, that's the thing though. Like maybe it's just because like my nostalgia goggles, but like I don't think I'm not looking back at like wow, Rocko's Modern Life. That was such a disturbing show. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
Same
I
here.
feel.
I was yeah, I wasn't disturbed by it. I mean, come on, like our generation had Ren and Stimpy for crying out loud.
Oh man, that's another show right there. Was it don't whiz on the electric fence?
Mhm. Right. And there's even a scene that had to be censored where Rin was like upset with Stimpy and his cousin, and he was just speaking in the most graphic terms on what he was going to violently do to them.
Well, I know they had a couple episodes that they were not allowed to air, so then they aired them like 10 years later on Adult Swim, and they did this new Ren and Stimpy show that was adults only. It was apparently really shitty. I never saw it.
Right.
Apparently, it sucked.
Oh, and I always find it funny when we're talking about American politics is like the false dialectic of black conservatism, because a lot of those people seem to just like reject like African history or their heritage, and they want to be like white people as much as possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've noticed this with like a lot of people don't want to really like acknowledge cultural diversity. A lot of people don't really want to acknowledge um, the the fact that Africa really has its own excellent, really fascinating heritage and customs and things like that. But I feel like a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that because they want to basically frame Africa alongside this Western standard of what a good society ought to be. So you have the Afrocentrists trying to basically say, no, actually, they were like, essentially exploitative civilizations, modernized civilizations, just like white people were. Then on the other hand, you have like white racists saying, oh, no, they weren't. And because of that, they were just backward shitholes. You know what I mean? Like, but it's like in both cases, they define themselves alongside the standards that have been set for them by the West.
Yeah, but then they go in denial mode when you bring up like that Nubian script existed. They go in denial mode to when you say that chariots existed in some empires down
Well, I mean,
there.
that's because it's that doesn't fit with ma IQ narrative. Like, oh well, that couldn't work because like you need to have a certain IQ in order to be civilized. Well, I mean, it's just like the people on the panel I was on last week, or I guess early this week, that they got mad when I pointed out, or I think that, or I don't even think they acknowledged it. They just started talking over me when I was trying to point out that the best evidence we have at the moment is that the smelting of iron began in sub-Saharan Africa. So the Iron Age would have started in sub-Saharan Africa. The reason why we advanced past the Bronze Age was because of what was going on in like West Africa.
Right. But then people like to forget that happened because they just pretend it never existed.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing. Like, of course, and then of course they could just be like, Mr. BAP and say that, well, that sucked because the Bronze Age was the best, right?
Well, and it's funny because, like, we're talking about like this country and civilizations in general, and civilizations usually don't survive very long throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I have been saying for quite a while now, for years now, that it's much better. It's a much wiser choice for society to make, to just not play this game, to just not gamble in the first place. People could say, and I know I've seen people say this, and people say this even on like some panels I've been on recently, that like, oh, well, I mean, a society fails if it lasts for 70,000 years but stays at the hunter-gatherer level. Bob was like, but what is your standard for that? What's the standard by which you could actually evaluate that? Because, I would say that even in spite of the, unfortunate end that most of the Australian Aborigines ended up meeting with, I would still say that they succeeded better than a lot of these great civilizations that had this major burst of activity for a couple hundred years and then fizzled out and died. I don't see that as being an achievement. I don't see creating a situation where people become self-insufficient to the point where when things go south, they all end up dying off because they can't support themselves. I don't see that as a victory. I don't see
It's not.
as a victory.
It's not, because when you think of like certain countries today that are modernized, there's going to come a time where the water source is going to be like very scarce. Electricity could be scarce, and all these other things that are necessities could become very scarce as well. And they think, well, we'll just develop something that will. And it was like there's this really bad faith, stupid argument regarding like AI or AGI, where this person was like, well, this technology, people said stuff about this technology. So, but see, the thing is, the difference between a gun or a bomb versus something that can think for itself is guns and bombs don't think for it themselves. Like they can't do nothing unless we, press a button.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's the thing is that I think it's just total cope. This idea that like, well, AI is going to save us. Like, it's almost, first of all, it's an admission that there's something wrong. That like, there's something that AI needs to save us from. That there's clearly some sort of problem that they're admitting is happening, and they're essentially admitting that we're desperate. We realize that we're screwed. We realize that the system's not sustainable. So we're going to put our faith in AI to somehow make it such where, human ingenuity and human capabilities are no longer necessary. We can just have robots do all the work for us. But that's a faith-based proposition. They have faith. They have this, bizarre sort of religious faith that AI is just going to come and save us. But I don't see that happening. I don't see, I don't think that humans are going to be able to create a version of AI such that it's just going to keep the system going indefinitely. Because in order for that to happen, humans still have to imprint AI with everything that it knows. And if humans are getting less and less capable of actually, keeping the system going, then the AI is going to reflect that. And the AI, if humans are getting dumber, the AI is going to get dumber too, because the AI relies on humans.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, stupid people can't make a smart program. I mean, humans are very fallible. And that's why, with hunter gatherer societies, they didn't run into these kind of problems because they kind of understood, we stick together, we do what we need to, we live within nature. And that's another thing, too, is like people crap on them because they assume that, oh, we don't live in nature. So all these spiritual beliefs they have is just ridiculous. Like, why are these Tuareg people, throwing something a certain way to cast out evil spirits? Why were the Aboriginals doing a dance during a funeral ceremony and waving, branches and stuff? And it's like, well, if you lived within nature where you're out away from technology and civilization, it's really not that far fetched because nature is a very unpredictable thing. And it makes perfect sense to like really kind of be more on your guard, spiritually and mentally when you're out in nature away from technology.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, and that's what they say about us is like, look at these idiots that are going around thinking that because they have like big machines that they go riding around in. Therefore, that they think that they don't need to coexist with the spirits, and as a result, the spirits abandon them, and they abandoned their ancestors. Their ancestors abandoned them, and they end up becoming a bunch of suicidal alcoholics. I mean, that's what people in these societies would say about us. Like, we don't seem to be actually living out the benefits of the system we've created. We're too smart for the spirit world, and as a result, we're in crisis. As a result, literally, like, there's a tremendous, vast mental health crisis right now in the West that's not getting resolved. It's not getting resolved because the thing that would resolve it would be to return to this more spiritualistic understanding, which I guess is happening. I mean, I guess that, like, one thing that's happening is that we are sort of, in spite of the best efforts of the media and of the elite to make this not happen, we are actually heading back into that world where, people are becoming more spiritualistically inclined like they were in a traditional society. But, that's not what's being pushed. What's being pushed are all these methods that don't work. Just trust your psychiatrist. Your psychiatrist is going to give you some SSRIs so that you can temporarily, by being addicted to these highly addictive drugs, which they're highly addictive, you can basically, forget for a few hours a day that you're clinically depressed. It's bizarre.
Yeah, that's true. And it's funny because, when you do live in nature, it changes your perspective. Because, like me, I'm always like really anxious when I'm out here. But then if I go somewhere that's away from like large crowds of people, away from traffic, away from the city, and I'm just out there where I'm just like within nature itself, all that anxiety vanishes.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's because it's what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, that's what's going on, is that we are not made to live in cities. I was actually having this conversation with somebody I knew earlier today. I'll talk about, like, the metaphorical interpretation of the story of Cain and Abel, that, and a lot of people don't talk about this and they don't understand this side of the story. But essentially, if you look at the story of Cain and Abel, essentially it's the story of Abel is pleasing to God. Why? Because he's a nomadic pastoralist, and Cain is not, because Cain represents the worst mistake in human history. He represents the settled urban agriculturalist living in essentially a state level society, and the idea is, Cain is seen as being the first murderer because this, agrarian state level society basically introduced large scale organized violence into the world.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you go back into the Old Testament, that's really deep, and that's a good point, because Cain creates the agricultural society. Then, when the fallen ones were teaching man technology and all this other stuff, they develop technology, they develop tools, and all this stuff happens, and they build civilizations, and then the world becomes so evil that God actually has to destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. Like, because it's an interesting analysis. It's like, um, everything becomes worse. Everything goes downhill. I mean, everything really starts with the apple in the garden, right? The apple in the garden itself is the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, there's a primordial innocence, that we lost that primordial innocence somewhere along the way, and I think it was basically the development of the state is what happened, is that we lost our primordial innocence that we had when we were hunter gatherers. We began to understand our nakedness, maybe, I mean, to some extent, probably in a physical level too, because a lot of, hunter-gatherer tribes would have just run around naked. But but at a psychological level, we understood our naked. We understand, as we develop into a state level society, into a more urbanized, more stratified society, we now begin to understand our our humanity. It begins to become something that humbles us. Um, and we now understand, this is why it's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is that like now
Hmm.
we start having, a philosopher class that's advising us on morality, but there's a certain sense to which is, well, because we need to be advised on morality, that's a sign that we've fallen, that we need to have this permanent philosopher class in our surplus economy with our, urban elites, basically. And some of these urban elites are going to go around and basically tell us, after spending long times just thinking and possibly, at least in some areas, doing drugs, they're gonna like come up with all these insights and tell us like, well, this is what the meaning of it. But like, we need all that, whereas we didn't necessarily need all that in the very earliest human societies because it was intuitive.
Right. Yeah, and see that's what's fascinating about it, because like after the flood, humans create the Tower of Babel, and then God has to intervene and split them apart because he didn't trust them to do something like that. And what do we see today? We see things like the Open Society Foundation that want to do something similar.
I mean, that's the thing, and essentially, and that's what Babel is Babel represents globalism. Babel represents this utopian vision of a world in which divisions and distinctions are pushed aside and suppressed, and we all become part of what we think is this great monad, but it never works. It
No,
never
it doesn't,
works,
and
and
it can't.
it becomes basically just a sign of our pride and our arrogance that we're attempting to do this. We're attempting to mess with an order that we're not meant to mess with. We should not want to build a world where everybody's the same, or everybody has the same culture, speaks the same language. There's nothing actually good that could possibly come out of that. It's never going to work. It's just going to actually create more conflict and more problems, as we're seeing right now.
Right. And then like, people admit like, this country's imploding, but people think the solution to its implosion would either be communism or fascism. And now we could just tackle those one by one. So like what would be what would be like the downsides of communism on the long run?
Well, communism, at least its classic formulation, is essentially Tower of Babel system. It essentially says that we should be, and this wasn't merely McCarthyist propaganda. There's a lot of truth in this, that communism from its outset it does view itself as being like a domino effect, that the whole world needs to become communist, that the whole world needs to suppress itself. What happened when Stalin took over is he began telling like the Tungus people in Siberia that your old ways are feudal and patriarchal, which is total bullshit, because they were a tribal hunter-gatherer society. They weren't feudal, but they were told like,
Right.
oh, you're a feudal society. You need to get over your old ways, and we're going to re-educate you in your like Soviet learning camps. Um, they basically they steamroll over the old. They try to start from scratch. They try to, essentially, you could argue that communism is a great reset. It's a way of saying like, what we've always had, like, let's just completely suppress that now. Let's say it's all bad. Let's deny it all, and let's reprogram your brain with something new. And it's something that's based on secularism and all these other values that are just garbage. Like, they're not going to actually
Exactly.
inspire anybody.
Yeah, because see, like it has good analysis of like what's wrong with societies, but then its solutions are terrible because it basically recognizes that capitalism and modern society are unhealthy for people and that alienation is bad. And they come to the conclusion that collectivism is good, which it is to an extent. But then they also say, like, we should get rid of everything old. We should depend on technology. And we've seen, what happened in the past, outside of China when these countries did what they did. And like China's been the exception, but then a lot of hardcore communists like Maoist and people of that nature will say that China's not even communist. And of course, you've been in China before. So, you could tell the audience what it was like living there.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, you saw a lot of essentially what I'd say is that it was a country where
the state was at war with the people, but the people only sort of kind of recognized that. Like a lot of people are just very much just totally, I guess, the Chinese version of Bugman, right? They were just completely like, just trust the system, just trust every, like, but there was almost this undercurrent of like very unspoken resentment within the Chinese, in that and many of them were just very, they felt like their government was forcing them to be something they couldn't be. Like the
Right,
government,
conforming.
and it was because, they still had a bit of like the old Chinese culture in them. They still, there were a lot of people that had like, little statues of the Buddha that they were just like counting on. Oh, I have a statue of the Buddha in my little, 7-Eleven. And I used to go to these 7-Elevens, just like freaking, I used to be a chain smoker. So I used to just go there and buy cigarettes, and there'd be like Buddha, a fat Buddha, Buddhai as they called him, not, the Buddha from India, but he'd be staring at you. He'd be like judging me for buying cigarettes. But like, but you weren't supposed to do that. Like that was technically illegal in China to have, religious imagery in your secular place of business, but people did it anyway. It's almost like, but there was this war between the Chinese government and the Chinese characters. Like the Chinese keep trying to convince themselves that they can be communists, but they can't. The Chinese character is just not amenable to, secular dialectical materialism, is not amenable to really any aspect of communism.
Right. That's why a lot of Maoists will say that, an anti-revisionist will say that China is not communist.
Well, I mean, it's not in a real sense. Well, I'll say is that it's kept the authoritarian structures of the Maoist era, but there's, I mean, China is actually a place, like if you are an enterprising entrepreneur, a business leader, like you can make bank in China. Like there's a lot of like really rich startup billionaires and stuff in China, and a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people don't realize that like China is actually, for a certain number of people, it's a very capitalistic society. For the masses, for the ordinary people, it appears to be essentially the communism of the Soviet Union. But for the people that are enterprising and are basically willing to, give off enough blowjobs to enough important people, they're going to rise up in the system, and they're going to end up becoming rich and powerful and basically subverting the entire claims of equality and workers' rights and all that crap. And by the way, wasn't one of the main points of the original Marxist ideal to throw off the shackles of oppression of the industrial proletariat and all that? But I can't think of a country in the world where the industrial proletariat are more oppressed than they are in China, literally to the point where factory workers in masses are committing suicide because they're overworked.
Well, yeah, because like even during the Great Leap Forward, you had fatal factory accidents from people overworking themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's hold on. Whoops, boy. I was just having some technical issues, so if you just heard yourself echoing, that's why.
No, that's fine. I didn't hear that on my end.
Okay, good. No, it's the problem is that it just like, it seems as though the character, I don't know, like, like if there's anywhere in the world, I'm not necessarily going to say there's never a situation where a form of communism can't work, but it will have to be essentially like a tribal hunter-gatherer society. And of course, Engels talked about this, right, with this theory of primitive communism, that there was like a primeval communism at the very beginning that seemed to actually work quite well if you look at like Andaman Islanders or Pygmies or something like that. But the problem is that, trying to use technology and revolution and philosophy to just will ourselves back into that state, I think that's a stupid pipe dream.
It
And
is.
every single communist society has proven that it can't actually happen. There's not a single example of a successful communist state. And of course, the leftists and the Marxists will have to do a no true Scotsman fallacy and say, like, well, none of that stuff was really communism in order to try to justify this. But the reality is that communism was tried over and over. Lenin tried communism, and it was a mess, and Stalin had to come basically save it. And all these other leaders, like, they tried communism, but they just ended up producing chaos, because you can't force a society that's not a primitive hunter-gatherer society to start pretending it is.
Yeah, by the way, I posted Gen X Jeff's channels on the chat. Please subscribe to him, anybody that's there. So anyways, yeah, you're right. And you even told me, like, Ingalls himself was like just like an armchair anthropologist, because he didn't know anything about a lot of different societies that were hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, I mean, he made all these assumptions, and and this is very typical of the time, by the way. This is one of the reasons why, in the 20th century, the state of anthropology vastly improved, because you started getting people like Malinowski saying, no, actually, you're not qualified to talk about a society unless you've studied them personally, but unless you've actually, lived as a participant observer, aka you've made yourself one of them for a certain degree of time, such that you can really feel like you can discuss what the society's like. Because these early anthropologists, so many of them, James Fraser was another one, the guy who wrote The Golden Bough, which is like a major critique of religion, basically. He didn't actually study anywhere. He literally just he was like the modern day Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian that would just like listen to every little rumor that was whispered in his ear and report it as fact. Like, that was what James Fraser was, and he got so many things wrong, and he was really an embarrassing figure. But he's still considered one of the fathers of modern anthropology for some strange reason.
Well, yeah, the second one to address would be fascism, and that one's kind of fascinating because I used to dive pretty deep into that topic, and the more I learned about it, the more my opinion started to kind of shift towards it. Because at first I was kind of like thought, corporatism was kind of a good economic model, but the more I learned about like some of the other flaws within the system, the more I just kind of soured on it over time. And I do think like the biggest problem is when talking about it is, how can a state, be nationalistic and autarkic and isolationist, but then like what can it do like when the resources start running out?
Well, the fascists always ended up running into that problem, which is why they ended up not being isolationist after all. This is why, you got the fascist dictators ended up just becoming a bunch of warmongers who ended up destroying themselves by being that. And I'm not just talking about, Hitler and Mussolini, or something. I'm even talking about, you could argue all the fascist leaders, like what's his name, Soili in Comoros, who completely fizzled out and was a total disaster, who ruined his country, who ended up dying in disgrace. And to this day, his country is, out of all those island African nations, Comoros is by far the worst off, because even 50 years later, they're still dealing with the fact that this jackass was the leader at one point. And the problem is that the problem that fascism has, the big problem fascism has is that you look at actual examples of fascism, and they're the least viable. Like, they don't last very long. They always get themselves into trouble. They always get themselves in wars. They always end up biting off more than they can chew, and they always end up being defeated in the wars, and they always end up being deposed. Or if they don't get deposed in a war, what'll happen is they'll just have civil unrest, like what happened in Spain with the end of Franco, with Portugal with the Carnation Revolution back in the 70s, which deposed Salazar.
they create states that are actually internally very unstable. They usually come to power during a time of instability, and they usually create a system that relies on keeping alive that instability, keeping alive this sort of boogeyman, whatever the boogeyman that you want to introduce is into the society. That's what you use if you're a fascist. Usually it's communism, actually. It's like fascists traditionally have seen themselves as like, they basically say, if you're not one of us, you're a communist, basically out of the Joe McCarthy playbook. Joe McCarthy, of course, being a wannabe fascist, I would argue. And it relies on this. It basically relies on the dialectical tension that it claims is trying to get out of. Third position, right? The third position is supposed to be, you got like liberal democracy, secular democracy on the one hand, and then you got, on the other hand, you got communism. But no, we're trying to be this third position, this like super right-wing militaristic society that's also, has a high degree of protectionism when it comes to economics. So we're trying to like combine aspects of the left and aspects of the right together. The problem with that is that it's a system that's unnatural. The sort of state control and the sort of militarism that you see under fascism doesn't actually work very well. It creates a lot of resentment among the common ranks, and it creates internal, it creates like just a level of internal resentment, similar to what you see with the most extreme forms of theocracies. That's why you're seeing similar things going on right now in Iran, right? That like the Iranians are really like pissed off at the government, and there's like constant, like for the last 10 years, there's been like constant revolts against the government, which is basically a fascist system right now. It creates, because it's so hierarchical, it creates this idea where if you're not at the top of the hierarchy, you get really resentful of the people that are at the top. And oddly enough, it ends up, despite being so hardcore in trying to pretend that like, oh, we're the ultimate antidote to communism and leftism, it ends up breeding communism and leftism because people at the bottom get so pissed off, they join these leftist movements. That's how you got the Spanish Civil War. That's how you got when Franco was, or when his successor was finally deposed in the 70s, Spain went far left. I mean, Spain is it's not quite a communist state, but it's one of the most left-wing countries in the world now, and it has been since the 70s. Same thing with Portugal. Same thing, for a while with Italy. For a while, Italy was run by basically communists. Germany, obviously East Germany was run by communists up until 1989. You see that it basically, it has the seeds of its failure within itself. So to me, that's the problem with a fascist system.
Yeah, and see, the interesting thing about fascism's origin story, and this mostly just only applies to Italy, is you had a lot of syndicalists and socialists and communists who started to it was mainly syndicalists who kind of started to sour on the idea of anti-intervention. So they kind of took a more pro-war and nationalistic stance. And it was supposed to have more leftist elements in the beginning, but they kind of sold out to a lot of right-wing elements once Mussolini came to power, and a lot of its more leftist elements disappeared once, Mussolini started making concessions with the church and other things like that. So, like, for example, like a lot of early figures in the movement were pro-women's suffrage, but then afterwards, as books like Mothers of Invention show, once they came to power, they took women out of the factories. They even took women out of the schools because the men were complaining that they were taking all their gerbs.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that essentially, but you're going to do that. You're going to have a hard time not doing that, though, if you're basing your entire ideology on like faux traditionalism, which is another mistake that the fascists made. Another mistake that like the far right always makes is that.
And wouldn't you say that's what the Christian nationalists are doing now?
Well, yeah, because I see the Christian nationalists as being a modern form of the third position, in a sense, that like what they're doing is they're appropriating these ideas of like the same ideas that you see with like classic third position, like somebody like Mussolini, of creating this invented fake tradition based on like nostalgic propaganda of a world that didn't actually exist. Like, it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing that you saw with the classic fascists. You're seeing now with this idealization of the 1950s and this idealization of this nuclear family that itself was, modern and not very effective. Like, don't you want to go back to this world that was actually a piece of crap for the brief period when it did exist? But you don't know that because you weren't born then. So we're going to we're going to show you a picture of like this apparently happy family with the man who's this fucking loser who is, cheating on his wife and then brags about how his wife is a good earth mommy that is his, security blanket because he's got an Oedipus complex. And then finally his wife can't stand anymore and walks out on him. He becomes suicidal and the whole family just falls apart. It's just a disaster because this gender relations in the 50s were a mess. They were horrible, which is why the 50s got replaced with the 60s. But we're not going to tell you any of that because that would go against the little, dumbass nostalgia romantic narrative. Is exactly the way that classic third positionists work, though. You look at the propaganda that was coming out of Nazi Germany, it was the exact same way. It was, let's show you this image of this invented tradition that never existed, this wonderful world of like traditional German culture, and let's give you like, let's set it to some lovely Wagner music, and like you'll just feel all these feelings of like nationalism. It's just a very feelings based system, and it convinces it and socially programs and reprograms these, young single men to become cannon fodder for the system, which is what ended up exactly happening. All these fascist regimes, all these people ended up getting themselves blown up so that, out of this dream of this like romantic ideology of a nation that never existed.
Yeah, because of the funny part about that too is I was reading a book about like it was called The Seizure of Power, about the rise of fascism in Italy, and you had these squadristi members who were part of the black shirts that were beating up socialists and communists and breaking down union strikes. And what would end up happening later is those same people that were the aggressors took their own lives by shooting themselves in the head or committing suicide and other methods. Like, it's crazy to think that somebody who's the aggressor, that's really violent and just beats the crap out of their opponents, later on just decides, oh, I'm going to take my life and kill myself.
No, I mean, it would make more sense than somebody like, I would think that somebody that's more than happy to use a gun against everybody else would have fewer qualms about using it against themselves as well.
Yeah, that's a funny way of putting that, but it's pretty sick and messed up. And then it was funny too because there's this one really famous third positionist that I used to come on this channel that I used to talk to and look up to, and I mean, one of his favorite historical figures was Yukio Mishima, and the thing about him is he hated what Japan was doing, so his goal was to get himself ripped and muscular, only to kill himself at a young age.
Yeah, I mean, but it's arguable that that's part of that was part of the third positionist ideal. Is basically, you sacrifice yourself. It's a self-sacrifice.
It is
for a greater, well, you could argue in a sense it's actually an even more extreme form of collectivism than communism. It's like you literally are nothing more than just a part of a much larger whole, and it's like you're a warrior ant in an ant colony, and you're the you sacrifice yourself for the good of the whole. And it's the bizarre, twisted irony of all that is that when the time comes to sacrifice yourself, the fascist regime almost always ends up losing. So you end up sacrificing yourself for absolutely nothing.
Well, that's the thing about it is like, and it would be interesting for you to do a stream in the future critiquing futurism or the Futurist Manifesto, because one of their big things is one of the traits they love is the fact of dying young, dying in battle, war, death, and violence, and things like that. So like you're more honorable. It's more honorable for you to be, a 19-year-old that dies in a battle than to live old and die.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's essentially it's a glamorization of basically telling ordinary people, telling the working class, especially, to just be expendable cannon fodder, and and they find eventually that they're sick of doing that, and that's how you end up with the Carnation Revolution and all these other. That's how you end up with all these people, being deposed, and that's how you end up with all sorts of crap like that going down. Because finally, the problem that authoritarians in general have is that they don't seem to realize that if you actually push people too hard for too long, that doesn't end up well for you. I think of the story of Shaka Zulu as an example of this. He was an excellent statesman, an excellent general. He created a great empire, and then he just started doing incredibly stupid bullshit like, oh, my mom died, so now I'm going to ban eating. Now it's illegal to eat food. And, that's going to lead to your demise. No wonder people are going to are going to assassinate you when you literally have decreed that the whole nation must starve to death or else they get the death penalty, which is what he did. Like this sort of stupid bullshit. Like, it doesn't work. This overly, I used that as an extreme example of an especially incompetent authoritarian leader, but there's been so many examples of this that like people don't seem to understand that if you actually push too hard. I mean, why does the United States exist? Essentially because the King of England was perceived as being excessively authoritarian, and he thought he could get away with it because he thought that like, well, there's no way in hell these rednecks in America would ever actually have a successful revolution against me. But that's why King George III, he's a unique figure in that he's vilified as much by the British as he is by the Americans, because the British considered him a colossal embarrassment.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, because I read a book about the fall of communist Albania, and as soon as Enver Hoxha died, because Enver Hoxha was an authoritarian dickhead, he like banned certain forms of music, he banned religion, he banned beards, and then right after his death, his country becomes completely unstable. The people start protesting and almost downright rioting, and they were almost considering like starting to shoot these protesters, like the Tiananmen Square incident. But what it's happened instead is the communist state just collapsed, and the people got their democracy back.
Yeah, I mean that was going to happen if you have like a situation that pushes people to an extreme. You're going to get, and this is the problem that the leaders of Iran. This is why they're screwing up. Obviously, I'm cynical enough that I recognize that a lot of what's going on in Iran is just like bullshit, like color revolutions and stuff, CIA shenanigans. But even so, the CIA shenanigans wouldn't be successful if there weren't real resentment going on there. And what's happening is that essentially the leaders of Iran have done, like, they've basically just been really incompetent for a really long time, in that they've created a system that's overly authoritarian in like a theocratic religious sense. But for one thing, they're following a specifically weak position, which is Shia Islam. And it's not, like Sunni Islam and Shia Islam are very different systems. Shia Islam is a very weak position to take if you're trying to run a super authoritarian theocratic state, for multiple reasons. Number one, I don't want to necessarily go on like a long like tirade about like Sunni Shia differences, but like there are problems that naturally arise if you're trying to have a Shia state in general. And when you compound that with the fact that they had a long period where they tasted, secular liberalism, and then it was suddenly taken away from them. When you combine that with the fact that even the like so-called authoritarian theocratic dictators were actually kind of sort of still secular liberals, which is why Iran has, for the entire period since the 1979 revolution, Iran has basically had a really low birth rate. Like, people don't know this, but Iran is actually a much more liberal society, even at the governmental level, than it lets on that it is.
Right.
And then on top of all that, though, but you get, just this weird, unpredictable law system that on the one hand will tolerate large scale birth control, large scale like people not having children, even I think in some cases abortion, like they're liberal until then suddenly they just decide to like shoot people for not wearing the hijab or something like that. I mean, like it's a very arbitrary sort of system that gives people a taste of liberalism and then just arbitrarily enforces illiberalism. And it's like a bait and switch, and people get sick of it, which is why there's so much unrest right now in Iran.
Exactly. And it's funny too, because going back to this picture, I mean, this is what Andrew Wilson wishes America could be.
Well, I mean, I don't wish that America could be this, because this was not a good system. Like the relations within the family in this system were really screwed up, and they really messed up a lot of people. Like, like these people keep on acting again. This goes back to the idea that even if you assume this stuff is all gay ops, these things were successful. When people try to foment a revolution from the top down and the ordinary people don't want it, it fails. You look at what's happened. There have been many cases of these color revolutions that have just been tried and they've completely failed and fizzled out because people weren't interested in this. The 60s happened because there was a lot of actual resentment against the system that Andrew Wilson and other people like that idealized. The system was it was incredibly bizarre, incredibly wrong-headed system. It taught men to be Oedipal weaklings. It taught women to essentially subordinate their own will and their own desires to massaging the egos of these Oedipal weaklings. It taught children to be improperly socialized because they're taught basically that for a man to show any affection for their children is to be a homosexual. And so basically children grow up without a healthy relationship with their father. And so they end up having all kinds of problems, all kinds of mental complexes when they grow up. And it was just like, it collapsed on its own. It wasn't that like there was this secret evil cabal of Jays or something, the way Michael Jones says, that just collapsed it. It collapsed. Like, were there people that were trying to collapse it that were powerful? Yes, but they were successful because there were enough, ordinary people on the ground that wanted to collapse the system too, because the system just wasn't working for them.
Yeah, because they'll blame stuff like, oh, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, rock and roll, subversive culture, the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, or whatever. But really, it was just more the fact that it was a shitty system to live in, and people got sick and tired of it after a while. I mean, what woman wants to come home to some piece of shit that smacks you and tells you to go make a ham sandwich?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like the whole thing was, and the whole thing's predicated. And even if you watch like old movies or TV shows, that was what it was predicated on. It was predicated on this. That basically, like the family was a wish fulfillment fantasy for overworked men. That I could just come home to a loving wife and loving kids, and they're loving because I keep them in terror with my fucking belt if they ever act like they're not sufficiently loving enough. It's a maladaptive system. It didn't work, and it failed. It failed and it fell apart. And people today, mostly, unless they're, these LARPers, mostly they look back on that system with resentment, especially the people that were alive. That you talk to anybody, there's fewer and fewer of them still alive today, but you talk to like anybody that was a member of the silent generation, there's still some of them around, and they'll tell you the 50s were horrible. They couldn't stand growing up in the 50s.
Well, I watched like even a documentary of people that came back home from World War II, during the 50s, and you had people that were doing like behavior like mass shooters where some guy went on a rampage and shot a bunch of innocent people. You had people that would like wake up, you'd have people that would just wake up screaming bloody murder where they'd just be in bed and they just jump up screaming at the top of their lungs because of post-traumatic stress disorder. But then I gotta watch my language. But then people like Andrew will straight up say like, oh, anxiety's not an issue, people are just making this stuff up, like these aren't real problems, everybody's just weak today.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is that he's part of this thing, like, and so many people are like this contrarian, like ultra conservatism that just doesn't work. Like the problem is that this stuff has all been tried and it's failed. This idea that like you could just that like mental disorders are all just the product of you as a sick individual, like that's we've tried, that sort of approach to therapy, and it's always consistently made matters worse.
Right.
What I think needs to happen is we need to be aware that the problem finally comes down to society as a whole. If a society is going to be a sick society, it's going to breed sick individuals. But the problem is that these radical nationalists, they don't want to admit that there's a problem with the society, because to them, the society we're living in right now is the greatest society that there's ever been. And to say if there's any sort of problem with it would be to introduce the possibility it's not the greatest society that's ever been, which would cause an existential crisis for these people, because their entire worldview, their entire understanding of everything around them is predicated on this notion that we've got the goods and that everybody else is just like, the whole rest of the world is just begging to have what we have. All these nomadic peoples that are going around, literally fighting wars, rebelling for sometimes 50 years on end against governments that are trying to modernize them because they don't want to modernize. Well, that's just liberal propaganda. Like, no, the reality is that they're just begging for all our stuff. Like this is just such a childish attitude, though.
It is. And then there's a question that House TV was asking about, how do we feel about open borders? Well, here's the thing about that. It's kind of a complicated topic because most nomadic tribes didn't have to deal with borders. But at the same time, when you create a modern nation state, it kind of has to depend on stuff like that, for better or worse, for its survival. And that's not necessarily, I don't know, like you could tell me if you think it's a good or a bad thing, TCPS.
I mean, I would say that an ideal society wouldn't have, like, I don't think that the idea of having countries is a good thing, personally. Like, I think that, like, I'm not saying this in like some stupid, like John Lennon, liberal cosmopolitan sense, but like, I don't think that that having, to me, I have a unique understanding, I guess, of like the value of borders from the fact that so many of the borders that there are in the world are like garbage borders that nobody wanted. Like, there should not be a place called the Central African Republic. There should not be a place called the Republic of the Congo. All these Democratic Republic of the Congo, all these like fake lines drawn on maps by like some colonial administrator or something like that.
Yeah.
There could have, there were times when there were traditional, like obviously traditionally tribal societies have had certain territories that are like, well, this is our territory. And if you start, pushing into our territory, then that's an act of war or something like that. In that sense, is that borders? Yeah. I mean, that you could argue that is a form of a border, but that's not
right.
Like,
by the way, Pill Eater's here for a second.
Hi, guys.
Okay.
Good evening.
Hi, Carl. Hi, TCP.
How's it going?
Not that much. I'm in Busan right now, so it's a 11-hour difference, I think. I'm ahead of you guys.
I used to live like
hours.
right near Busan, so like I lived in like a suburb of Busan for about a year and a half.
Oh, really? I'm in Yeongdo right now.
Nice. I
That's
remember
like
I
the
used
island.
to I
What's
used
that?
to go to Haeundae Beach for like partying and stuff. That was the main thing I
Uh,
remember Busan for.
yeah, we're close by Songdo Beach and near the Yeongdo Bridge, and there's a giant latte Gwambak department store there. So yeah, right now it's 2:39 p.m. here.
Nice.
Wow. So Pill Eater. So what was your thought on a lot of those people on Twitter making a big fuss about that family eating a McDonald's meal just because it looked wholesome?
Are you talking about the McDonald's meal from the Japanese ad, or?
Yeah, like the anime family where it
Okay,
just
so
shows
there's
like,
it's really funny. A lot of people, or not a lot of people, but like three of my friends literally wanted my opinion on a silly, harmless McDonald's ad that was like, it was like the anime. It was the guy with the black hair, the girl with red hair. And
yeah,
yeah,
the
that was
two
it.
women.
It was pretty much
Yeah.
it. It was basically just like an anime short for like Japan of McDonald's, which was basically like, I don't know why anybody would feel outraged by it. I don't know exactly I think it's just the argument was, look at cool commercials. How come the West
Yeah.
has Clown World and how come Japan has cool commercials? That's the only thing I got from it. And I just feel like, well, if you want a cool commercial, I mean, David Lynch did some cool commercials, quote unquote, but it doesn't change the fact that it's selling McDonald's. That's what it's supposed to
Right.
do. So it's like this outrageous, like, it's not a win for the culture war, and it's certainly not a win for like critics of like clown world criticism. It's like, well, McDonald's is selling a product in Japan for Japan McDonald's, and they would play anime by Japanese. So I don't. Again, there were some other arguments, like some of my friends were like, "Whoa, cool, Eurasianism." I'm like, not exactly. It's pretty much, there's an anime commercial for like everything else in Japan. So I think it's just the West getting, or I think it's just like anime nerds getting mad because McDonald's is shown in good light in the outside context of the American West. So again,
Yeah.
I don't know what the issue is. I mean, everyone, Japan also has Moss Burger. People are not talking about Moss Burger. Moss Burger has a couple of anime commercials, and Korea has a Lotteria, which is basically Latte, the fourth biggest corporation in Korea, and nobody blinks an eye at Lotteria.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking things.
Yeah.
I
Well,
just turned my camera on because you could probably see Songdo over there,
oh,
and
nice.
three of those buildings down here. This is on Yeongdo. Over there is Gogumasa. So that's like the mountain where potatoes were originally found in Korea. So there's lore between, Gogumas, potatoes, and San, the mountain. It's like right there. And yeah, pretty much that's all I just wanted to show that I'm not making this up. I'm not in like Looney Tune land or anything. I'm actually in.
Oh, I believe you. I know
Some
you're
people
very
are
well
like,
traveled.
people think I'm like, it's a psyop. So, but TC, or it's TSP, right? It's So
You could
you
just
were in
call them trad culture for short.
trad culture. So you were in Busan what years?
2019 to 2020. I got out when COVID started.
Okay, that's really funny because I came in 2020. I came in during the lockdown, and I had to go through 10 days in Gimpo and then travel to Busan. So I went down like the 14-day lockdown. I was in Korea during the time of COVID lockdown, and yesterday was a Chuseok, so it's technically the first Korean Thanksgiving without COVID restrictions or anything like that. I mean, I never got COVID boosted or anything like, I never got any of that stuff. So I was in Korea by that time. That was it was kind of crazy because if you remember, you had to go to a department store, you had to have a Korean cell phone or just say to call a number so the government could track you. But the funny part was, if you're a foreigner and you don't have a Korean phone, you could just like fake it and then assume they're tracking you. I don't know, because they don't treat foreigners seriously in Korea. So it's very I don't know, very strange time.
Oh yeah, well, it was so easy to leave. I mean, partly because they wanted me gone because it was COVID, but like It was amazing. Like it was so hard to get into Korea and so easy to leave.
Were you doing a missionary service there?
No, I was working there. I was a teacher.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm here with my family, or my wife's Korean, so I'm here with the family, and just we'll be here for 2-3 months until we go back to San Francisco. So it's weird that I was telling you guys I was taking a flight to Busan SF hours, so it's kind of now just a little wonked being hours ahead. So
is that you, Comrade Freaky?
Yes, it's me. It's been a long
I haven't talked to
time.
you. Yeah, I haven't talked to you forever because I really wanted you to talk to TCPS because he studied Australian Aboriginal culture, and right here, like, is a real Australian Aborigine. So that'd be
Yes,
actually pretty
and
good
to
to talk
prove,
for
I'm
you
gonna
two.
put my camera on.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I'm not a coconut, all right.
Oh wow, I think you're a first. I don't think I've met anybody who I knew had Aboriginal blood before.
Yeah, I'm mixed Anglo Celt Aboriginal, so I'm pretty much what you can consider a half caste in Australia. Yeah.
pretty much have a James Bond supervillains agency here, where like everybody's on a different part of the globe, and we're all
Yeah.
like planning some like evil powers of sorts.
Yeah,
Of,
I can't wait for the evil cabal. By the way, Australia's going through some clown shit right now.
So I've heard.
Yeah, especially with the fucking referendum. Oh my, the Discord. You probably don't know what I'm talking about. The referendum, but there's a referendum going on in Australia where the current Labor government is trying to bring in this thing where they want to. Is this referendum that has two purposes? It's called It's basically constitution recognizing Indigenous Australians as the first Australians. But there's also another thing where they're trying to set up a thing called the Voice, which is kind of like a advisory commission to the Australian government that would give advice to the Parliament about how to improve Aboriginal Australian lives. But it's so vague that the policy is so vague, and the government's been come under fire that a lot of people, and there's been a lot of conspiratorial things about it, especially among what we call in Australia the cookers.
Well, let me guess. It's just probably a bunch of fancy words for just saying that they're not going to do anything, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. It's basically, I think if it's pretty much, it's not going to pass because it was actually quite popular, but a lot of people just, because of the vagueness of this institution that's called the Voice.
Well, I do have a good question for you, though, because since you live in Australia, isn't it true that they started hiring a bunch of Aboriginals in the forest department just because of all the horrible fires that happened recently?
I've not heard that particularly, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did hire because it has been especially where I live in the Northern Territory, it's been pretty bad in terms of bushfires this season. So yeah,
so I want to.
Bad.
Oh, can you ask TCPS what the Northern Territory was like before colonialism?
Oh, that's quite interesting. The Northern Territory is very much, it's called the final frontier because it's the last place in Australia to be settled, in that there's still a big chunk of the Aboriginal population that still speaks their language and still lives close to their land. And a big chunk of the population up here still lives in rural areas as well. Though there is major metropolitan areas, it's still pretty much a bit towards the rural area than in the urban area. And it was different because the Northern Territory was not even a state. It was administered by the federal government until 1910. Then we were hold on. No, we were part of South Australia, and then in 1910, South Australia gave up the ownership of the Northern Territory and gave it to the Commonwealth government, as in the federal government. And it was basically administered from 1910 to 1978, was directly controlled by the federal government. So a lot of interesting things happen in the Northern Territory in terms of kind of like a laboratory thing. Like, for example, we've got Pine Gap. And if you know something about Pine Gap, it's big spooky stuff that goes on there, if you catch my drift.
Yeah. Well, so trad culture, could you tell them what the Northern Territory was like before it modernized?
Well, from what I understand, it was so historically it would have been oddly enough, it would have been to the extent that there was anything cosmopolitan in Australian terms for thousands of years, it would have been the Northern Territory, because the Northern Territory would have been settled later, still very early on, thousands upon thousands of years ago, but later, which is why most of the peoples in the Northern Territory, they don't like their languages don't belong to the same group as the rest of Australia. So like most of the desert people would have been part of a group called the Pamanyungan peoples.
Yeah.
The Northern Territory was not, or parts of it were, but this northern part, especially Arnhem Land and that sort of area, was not. So there would have been more cultural diversity for one thing, and also there's a belief. I believe, I don't know if it's true or not, but there's a belief that they were actually contacted about 100 years before the other Australians. They were contacted by like Indonesian traders or Indonesian like fishermen.
Yeah.
That wouldn't shock me because some of the tribes have nappy hair and most of them don't.
Yeah, it makes sense up here, especially because I live way up top, called the top end, where Darwin is and Arnhem Land. That's very close to Indonesia. And there's also been historical accounts of Chinese vessels coming up here during when China used to be a great empire. So it used to be some contact up north, let's just say.
But I do question, were Aboriginals originally from India? Because they do kind of look like it in a ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that classic. Yeah, that's been going on. That discourse has been going on for like, I would say it really peaked in the last decade.
Well,
And
I
yeah,
just think it's fascinating to think that a group of explorers would go to a continent that nobody's in, and then all of a sudden just give up whatever life they had to just become more in touch with nature and to just basically pretty much reject technology for centuries.
Well, the thing that you have to keep in mind is that, like, well, a couple of things. For one thing, the Australian Aborigines, when they came to Australia, everybody was still a hunter gatherer. I mean, it was like it was about 70,000 years ago that the first Australians would have showed up there, and Australia really was a very vibrant environment, especially the northern part that wasn't maybe so dry. It was a nice place to be. There were a lot of perks to living in Australia. I mean, there were negatives as well, like giant spiders that could kill you and things like that. But there were a lot of perks to living in Australia. There were a lot of reasons why people, when they got there, they would have wanted to stay there. To me, the thing that's actually more strange is what was going on with the Tasmanians, because the Tasmanians were apparently of a different stock than the mainland Australians, and apparently they had sailed to Tasmania and then they forgot how they sailed there, so they just got stuck there for thousands of years.
Yeah, that's fast.
Yeah, I can agree to that because Tasmanian Aboriginals were very different to the mainland, especially my tribe, because my tribe's the Tiwi, and we're different from mainland as well because we're island, way up north. We're the most northern island in Australia, and second biggest to Tasmania, and we're pretty much like the Tasmanian Aborigines and isolated. In fact, our dialect is very similar to some that resembles dialect or something like that in Papua New Guinea. So we have a very Papuan sort of vocabulary, different to the mainland because of isolation.
Tiwi's a language isolate, right? It's not related to any other language.
It's related to Papuan. There is similar to Papuan, but we're different as we don't. Yeah.
I've got to interject really quick to make a quick announcement. So, anyways, to those who are subscribed to this channel or who are currently watching it, Pill Eater's going to be a second. Pill Eater has pretty much got the keys to basically host exclusive content on here.
Yep.
So look forward to that. So basically, when my lazy butt isn't producing content, Pill Eater's pretty much got the keys to take over.
If you want, I know you gave me the SteamYard, right? So it should be just live streaming where I could just
you can create. Okay. Yeah, you can broadcast it on both this channel and your channel at the same time.
Got it. Yeah, I'll definitely consider in the future. Just but I definitely would like to do that for sure.
Yeah, you have my permission to do whatever. So I know you produce pretty interesting content, and sometimes you get some good interviews. So that would help the channel.
I like that. Yeah, I'll definitely think of something when things.
It would be really nice if you could get like an interview between yourself and Trad Culture and Keith Preston, because it'd be interesting for Trad Culture to have an interview with Keith Preston.
It's weird because it's like it's here's the thing. I remember there was a time when people would do pre-recorded podcasts and you would record it on like Skype and then later uploaded it, but today everybody's like live TV show where it's like, all right, I'm going to put this live and we're going to do this in one take and then get someone on. I mean, that's kind of like the standard now. So it's like,
well, you could also do pre-recorded stuff too, and then just upload it later by putting other visuals over it. So you could record you could record the video, and then and then when you're done, you could just put another video
on SteamYard or something.
Yeah,
because I thought SteamYard was just like live recording.
Yeah, it is. You could also do pre-recorded stuff with StreamYard, and you could even just, if you're downloading it, you could just download the audio recording, and then you could just put whatever visuals you want.
I mean, obviously, I would like to do more live things, but it's good. Right. It's good to notice about this. But yeah, I definitely consider. I mean, I just haven't been doing the interview stuff because of work and whatnot. And my friend Cartrell Payne, who I've known for the longest time, is the one who just reaches me out of nowhere and. All of a sudden we're talking to someone else, and Cartrell's making connections, and I'm the one that should get off my lazy butt and actually, get people, because I do have connections. I just work,
Yeah, that's understandable. Offline stuff can just kind of get in the way of content creation. I mean, that's kind of what's happened with this channel. I just had a lot of offline stuff going on. And I usually don't really get a lot of time to record stuff until it gets closer to fall.
Here's the thing. Here's some of my connections. It could be as eclectic as, I don't know if you know this guy, Eddie Fitzgerald. He was an old animator who worked with Ralph Bakshi. He lives near my hometown of Upper Pennsylvania, and some of his stuff is really interesting. But he's retired. Very interesting.
I know that.
To talk to.
Yeah, I know that Chad Hag, and the Machine Lies, who's friends with Trad Culture, also knew Chad Hag, and Chad Hag.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's one thing to talk about Dissonant Spirit, Chad Hag and Keith Preston. What I'm saying is, when I was doing it with Robert Stark, we'd just get people who worked in different art industries that were just and then connect them in. It's like we're one thing to talk to Ralph Bakshi and another thing to talk to Chad Hag, and then Break the Rules kind of does that in a way. I mean, Lev is interested in that. And, it always is fun to get John R. Dilworth on or something, but Lev was never in, or something, but it's oh, come on. It doesn't have to be about politics. It just be about someone's art. I do like to focus on things like that because it opens up people.
Well, see, that's the thing. It's me and Trad Culture, we don't really talk a lot about politics either much. I mean, I don't really even consider this a political channel anymore because I just
that's the thing. The fun part was creating an evil NPR. There's one thing where it's NPR where you're interviewing interesting people, and then it could be evil where it's you're against normal liberal narratives where it's okay, it is the rhizomic possibility of getting an artist on and then having a political dissident and then all sharing the same platform. That's kind of what early, Street Carnage and Vice magazine was before it sold out to Disney in a weird way.
Right.
But you don't see that anymore. I think everything has become inflated and nobody likes pre-recorded podcasts anymore unless it's someone.
Yeah, a lot of media's definitely changed a lot. But it's also kind of funny too when talking about this stuff, because like back to the original topic of the stream, since you kind of came in late, what's your opinion on like the contradictions in America and like just the political spiritual complex?
Okay, the American politics and their spirituality. Well, the
Yeah.
thing is, I don't know if America has a spirituality left. It could just be a confused and eclectic Christianity mixed with liberal capitalism and middle class values. Really hard to say if that's religious at all. It could be just a spirit of sorts. I think America has to be the most atheistic country on the planet. I think it's right when the Middle East loves to say that they're satanic or something.
Right.
But
Well, it was good to yeah, it was good to talk
I
to.
don't really have an opinion on it.
Yeah. So how did that feel, trad culture, to talk to a real Aboriginal for the first time?
Oh, it was interesting, I mean, and he actually, it seems like I knew more than maybe I thought I did, because he confirmed a lot of the things I've read. I've never been to Australia. It would be, ideally, I would like to go if, the government decides to stop being shitty. But like,
Yeah.
I mean, like but it was an interesting experience. It's certainly something that I'd like to, when I first set up this channel, I didn't really take it seriously for a couple of years, but my dream at the very beginning, when I made this channel in 2020, was that, eventually I wanted to have on like actual people that were either representatives of their tribes or else anthropologists that studied their tribes, or linguists, or people like, Roger Blench, who's a prominent linguist / anthropologist. And I've reached out to him a few times and he never responded to me. But I want to have stimulating conversations with people from these various communities, or else at least people that are experts that know a lot about these communities, and we could sort of help to reconstruct what unfortunately in many cases is a rapidly dying folklore, rapidly dying societies.
Yeah, because I think like when you tried to reach out to the Crucible and do stuff on there, that was like more of a potential roadblock than a springboard, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to say in retrospect that's probably the case, just because of the nature of the Crucible itself. It's not really conducive. I've known other people, I've seen other people that have had debates and things like that on the Crucible, and it's really has not registered at all. I mean, they've never.
Well, the thing with them is you're only really going to get a platform there if you have more mainstream opinions, and the most dissident opinions is just going to be ortho bros or like people that are rad libs. That's it. Like you're not going to get like people that are
What's
like
this podcast program? I don't think I listened to it.
The Crucible. It's a debate platform hosted by Andrew Wilson, who's a Paleo Con Christian nationalist.
I might have came across it, but I'm not so sure.
Well, like Vaush recently had a debate with Andrew Wilson that was a total shit show.
Oh.
Like there were so many opportunities.
Dude, that's like Haas and Jay Dyer. It's like what's going to be It's like nothing.
That just happened recently, and it only lasted for 5 minutes before Jay kicked him.
Right. It's just like Haas reads from a script to be like a funny terrorist, and then Jay Dyer gets mad. It's like, I think it's all planned, pre-panned or something. I don't know.
Yeah, we were like listening to Haas talk about it before the stream started, and he was like trying to say like Jay Dyer's real Christianity is occultic and he's not really a true Orthodox Christian, which other Orthodox Christians have said about Jay. I mean, trad culture was a part of Jay's community for a while, and he knows a few things.
The only time I ever talked to Jay was 2017 on Robert Stark's program. And all we talked was about David Lynch and Twin Peaks, and it was hardly about religion whatsoever.
Right.
This was like before he only had like 1,000 subs back in 2017. He was like no different from us. I remember. Even from a little bit of time when Haas was like 2K subs.
Yeah, but that's the thing with these internet guys. It's like when they're like less than 1K subs, they're more willing to like be more down to earth and humble. And then once they
Right.
get, once they hit the big show, that's when they
Then
start getting
when
really
they're
cocky.
20, 30K, then it's like they pretend they're it, and it doesn't. And like 30K does not matter to like Markiplier, who has like 6 million, or like 20 million. So that's like a ridiculous number. But it's like in the little small niche spheres, like 30K subs is considered godlike, which is nothing compared to like any huge. It doesn't make sense mathematically speaking. But it does something to people's minds for sure. Yeah, it makes them feel like they can reap profit from people or something.
Right. And that's like even like with Andrew Wilson. I remember back in the day when he was on Politically Provoked, just being like a small name debater who nobody knew about before founding the Crucible.
Or there was a like pre-YouTube 2006, 2007. It was like Ryan Folk and Culture Thug talking,
Right.
and hardly any of those videos survived. Yet it
Oh
happened.
yeah, because they had an epic feud. And then Ryan got his channel taken down.
And this was before Fringe Elements. This was like before Fringe, and he was going by I forget what the name was, but it was just that was Ryan Folk, and Culture Thug was somebody
Stoldles.
else. Doodle.
Yeah, Stoldles
This is
and
like
Quest.
2006. It was just like pre time. So those people, Ryan and Culture Thug, in some bizarre way, were considered innovators. They were just doing it at a time where it was too esoteric to know.
Yeah, the internet hadn't caught up with that yet. It was like prehistoric, YouTube at the time. Back when YouTube actually used to be a lot more interesting. Because
Right.
like you remember
You can upload
Neurojack.
full episodes of Hey Arnold and not be taken down for like 6,
Right.
7 years.
Well, because remember Neurojack Trad Culture?
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, because remember, like a lot of his videos were kind of similar to a lot of the older videos that used to be on YouTube all the time.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see where you're coming from.
Yeah, because I used to look at videos like that all the time when they were type in conspiracy stuff, and you'd see like various clips, thrown together about certain events happening and all this other stuff.
You can watch Denier Bud's 1/3 of the Holocaust straight up on YouTube, and like really like moon denial stuff and like hardcore like conspiracy stuff on like 2007 YouTube. And I clearly remember it. It just only took like you to write Holocaust denial in the bar and it would come up. And that's what I'm saying is like somebody else would like upload every single episode of Angry Beavers too. Like literally Viacom was not like monetizing it or whatsoever. So it's like if I was in high school in like 2008, I wanted to watch like one weird the Halloween episode of Angry Beavers. It would be there in parts or just like straight up uploaded with like the old browser.
I remember the days when they used to have a conspiracy radio show that was on like late night radio called Coast to Coast. I don't think they used to have that anymore.
There's also Jeff Rentz. I mean, Jeff Rentz is technically still going on, depending who listens to it. And for some time, David Duke was on it for some odd reason. I think he still was. But Jeff Rentz, that was like in 2009, that was like weird stuff about like, oh, don't drink fluoride, it'll make you gay. Like before Alex Jones saying the frogs were gay. Or it would be like, there's aliens on Mars and they're not talking about it. And so like any single fringe thought was on jeffrentz.com. And it was just like at a time where the anti-liberal thoughts were considered conspiratorial, and that was its target audience.
Nice.
Yeah, I remember Rentz. I never listened to his show, but I just used to go to his website.
Yeah, the fun part was his website. So it's like, I remember there was a guy named Ted Tweetenmeyer. He wrote a book you can still find online where it's like, with the new recent Mars photos, there's like aliens on the planet. And here's why. And he'll show it. He was even on Red Ice Radio. Because Red Ice Radio early on had people like Nick Land and Colin Wilson, and was just completely conspiratorial before we moved on to white nationalist politics. And
well, I remember back in like the 2000s, Red Ice got its start as basically being like some pro-Duganism thing.
Right. He was more Henrik Palmgren was like more into the whole I don't know, the white nationalist stuff really felt like a cash-in that was like happening with early alt-right movement. It made sense, but it felt way too like dry. And it turned out like the early connections was just like Rents, where it's like, all right, if you're into white nationalist stuff, you're probably also into the theory we never landed on the moon. There was a time where it was stigma like that.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep, and Jeff Rents has his like classical, he looks like Beethoven, but he has a mustache on. And that's why he's like, I'm pretty sure he interviewed Eric von Daniken, where it's just like about ancient alien civilization and stuff like that. Another guy you got to check out too is Bob Larson. Bob Larson is like this exorcist guy who says, you know, he's the only living exorcist who just like gets demons out of people's body, but he's like the only person who's actually had public interviews with like Boyd Rice and James Mason, like the esoteric Order of the Nine Angles type of neo-Nazi Satanist, and like Bob Larson is like connected with them in all weird ways of another.
It was funny though, because before you came on, me and like trad culture were talking about the whole synthwave aesthetic that a lot of people on the Ortho Bro and Tradcath and all these other people are using. Even people on the left are using it. And you know, in the 80s, you didn't even have anything like synthwave because you only had like synth pop, minimal synth, cold wave, and stuff like that.
Right. Well, synthwave, that's a form of irony invented in 2011, 2010. There was a band called Miami Nights 1984. They had an album, just that. It's a really good album, but that was just some Spanish producer who was just, you know, I'm going to make some funny songs about Miami, and that basically caught on. And that decade-old record basically influenced the kind of, in a way, we think of Beards and Beardedly with irony bro stuff. It's like that's really what it was. It was just nostalgic tripping about hypothetical Miami Vice, you know, whatever. And it's this, and you know, and then you got to remember in 2015, when internet culture was meme worthy, and like you had that early Blank Banshee record with like Simpsons Wave, it became obvious that some of the political factions were like, oh, we can just create Bash Wave. It's not a real genre. It's just, the only thing you can point fingers at is Xerius, but Xerius is just another like guy who shows up to MPI or whatever. And it doesn't mean your music is going to be any good or any better. You know, it doesn't, there's no specific, it's not like third stream music, right? Third stream refers to like classical and jazz as a hybrid. You can't make up, Bash Wave is not a genre because that's just an aesthetic. It's a meme idealism. And so that's what you're telling me about these like, okay, Christian synth wave or like memes or like Juche wave. It's just like a form of humor in meme culture and catering collage art aesthetics. It's not a real foundational genre that's pushing boundaries or the way we analytically think about things. And honestly, I think that has a lot to do with internet culture, meme culture. And remember, some of these are just long forgotten, kind of like a C-punk. That was kind of like an early vaporwave joke in 2012 on Tumblr culture. That was just like dolphin stuff. But that was like, the equivalent of that is like birds are not real. You know, it's just like, oh, I can't take conspiracy theories because birds aren't real. So again, it's a difference between what is a real genre, like third stream, like hybrid fusion, and then between what is like fake and like an ideal of like marketing sense, and things are just made up out of thin air to push an agenda. And I think of the synth wave as an easy copy paste idealism Trojan horse to get a point across, rather than the artist having his reign over the stupidity of people.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent analysis. Listen, I have to bow out right about now, but it's been great.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I'm probably
Yeah,
going to
great
end this
time.
pretty soon.
I'm just
All right.
gonna. The last time we do is just shamelessly shill for my channel, Traditional Culture Preservation Society, aka TCPS. Everybody needs to subscribe to that. I need to get my viewership and my subscriber numbers up. as many
Well, like I
ways as
said,
possible. So
well, I was going to tell you really quick. You can like upload this stream to your channel as well. So,
okay, yeah, I
and
think
I'll
I'll
link
do
your
that.
channel in the chat. Like you're up to 159 subs now, so you're starting to grow slowly but surely.
I know, right? Just trying to do whatever I can.
Yeah, thanks for
I
coming
mean,
on.
Well, thank you for
All right.
having me.
All right, talk to you again.
All right,
See
so
ya.
I will wrap this up at the 250 mark. So we got like a good 5 more minutes to just kind of shoot the shit.
Yeah,
Till
I came 2 hours late. I know you sent the direct link, but I was
it's
out
all right.
I was out walking Nampo and doing grocery shopping. And again, grocery shopping was at Latte Mart, but just doing whatever, and we got a bunch of fun stuff. I would show you videos or whatnot, but it's hard to do video transfer. Maybe I could live stream from Busan. I don't know, but a lot of fun stuff to do. Pretty much the only foreigner here. I don't think there's any other Americans in Busan. It's very it's weird, but it's fun. It's fun in many ways.
Right.
I could practice my Korean and whatnot. And but
Are
yeah,
you pretty good at Korean?
I'm learning my Hangul. I'm picking up words, yes and no, looking direction. I am getting it all down, but it takes very slow. But I'll get there eventually. It's very a lot. There's a lot of cool stuff, and there's a lot of interesting things in Korean culture, and it's always fascinates me for sure.
Yeah, a couple guys in the chat were loving what you were talking about. Like Chris was like, "Yes, yes, yes, dude knows his
Yeah.
shit."
Oh, who's Chris Slater?
He's one of Gen X Jeff's friends. So, Gen X Jeff
Okay.
usually live streams on his own channel, and he was in the chat earlier. But Chris is like always on his streams.
Wait, I just have to show you something really funny. So this is Oreos. This is Korean
Yeah.
Oreos. And so if you remember in the year like 2001, 2003, they were in America, but only for like 2 years. But for some
came
odd
back.
reason in South Korea, it never went out. It became really popular among Korean people, and they kept it. So here you go. And then you have Cocoa Pops with the monkey. So
Oh yeah, I saw those at Walmart. Except
So,
I think,
yeah.
except I
You
think
will not
instead of the
find this-
monkey,
Yeah, you won't find. Yeah, the monkey is only in Korea, though the monkey has been around since like the 80s and 90s, but the monkey never left Korea. So, little cultural difference there too. Thought that would be of interest. And here's
that's really cool.
the Busan Tower.
That's a beautiful view
Yeongdo
of the
Bridge.
bay.
Yep. Yeongdo Bridge, Latte Mart, all part of Yeongdo, and yep, that's probably what you can see from.
Usually when I see the bay, it just makes me think of Dad because he'd always want to go fishing all the time. He used to go fishing with this guy out in the oceans, but this guy that he was fishing with was just a total dumbass. So they got into like a heated argument on how to gut fish because you're supposed to gut fish with a knife. And the guy,
Wait,
the other
who's
guy
this?
was using scissors. Oh, my dad. So this
your
other
dad.
guy,
Okay.
yeah, this other guy who he was fishing with would use scissors to cut the fish. And you're not supposed to gut them with scissors. So they got into a big fight about that. And then the other guy got so butthurt that he's like, all you do is just bring drama on our trips, and I can't handle your drama.
Right. Well, there's
And
a
it
big
was-
fishing community also in Korea too. Like there's fishing stores, rent-a-boats, and the fishing channel on TV. So fishing's a
Interesting.
huge part of Korean culture.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I mean, again, I would like, if I had time, I could show you eventually. I mean, this is kind of big off topic, but the cable here, you not only that you have, 2 fishing channels, you also have channels related to anything from cooking to StarCraft to, table tennis. You have at least a channel dedicated to every hobby, as there is genre of shows and to specifics. So I find that very as a contrast that you will not find in the States. It's
Right.
kind of hard to imagine you have a channel dedicated just to playing StarCraft from like 1996.
That's
But it's a part, and it's like they treat StarCraft like chess with commentators, what you should do, what you should not, because one of the other hobbies is going to the PC bong, the PC room, and playing StarCraft. So
yes, it's that one person says Reddington says StarCraft channel sounds awesome.
yep.
By
Sometimes
the
I'll
way,
just get bored and watch it.
Pill Eater has his own channel as well, so feel free to subscribe to it if you guys don't know about it. I'll link in the chat.
I haven't had time to upload videos on my channel, so I've just been like, if I do get the time, I'm just filming myself and trying to do video commentary like I do. Because what happens is I've just been writing. I've been writing for the last year and 2 years, and I find writing more. It's superior to writing in a weird way.
Would it make more sense to link your Substack then?
Oh no, I mean if you just go to the YouTube, it's just my Substack is there. My website, it's www.pilleater.com. So it's like YouTube goes to my website, and like if I'm doing video visuals, it will be on my YouTube, and so it will be on my BitChute, my Odyssey, Internet Archive. So everything's mirrored. But I've just been producing more writing because I came of age where I believe you could get thoughts and complex ideals down by just writing. I mean, you could just film yourself, and there's an area for like Jay Dyer, Bosch, and Haas just like doing improvisation and acting. There's a whole Cantbot idealism for it, but it's like ultimately at the end of the day, writing is like the best remedy for everything, and to get things that you couldn't do while acting and performing. But if I did have an improvised thought, like why did this Twitter user ban me, or what I think about things, then I'll film myself. But then I feel like to myself, well, I also just like writing, like literally I have a draft right now about why Diplomacy is the best board game ever.
Yeah.
And I could publish it on my website, but it's just like so weird that comes out when you're talking about like hardcore criticisms of white nationalist politics, and you write like a complete offshoot about diplomacy. It is kind of funny and eclectic in many ways, but I think that's the point of writing. And whatever, you got to just publish without care sometimes.
Yeah, and I love your writings. Your writings are actually very creative and pretty interesting.
Thank
the
you,
one
Carl.
the one that I would always like joke about with the chat though is that one you wrote about the chipmunk adventure, because I don't think
it's funny. Everybody that was an axe. That was a sleeper hit. That chipmunk sadism, pedophilia, and pornography, and that's funny because I just wrote that in like 2 days, just because I was actually watching it by accident on YouTube. I just realized how much I hated it. And for some odd reason, that article gets recited, retweeted, and even reposted on 4chan. Because they're like, oh yeah, look, how would anybody write about this? And I'm like, call it queer culture, call it eccentric. I just thought it was just it's just a dumb movie, honestly. And that's why
I know it's just funny though, because on YouTube you'll find a lot of content creators talking about how it's a great movie and how it's probably one of the best chipmunk movies.
Oh no, it's basically like sadist child porn, like torturous, evil. I hate that film. It's just like horrible, and I just think it's like so trauma bonding inducing that it wouldn't make any sense.
Well, it's funny too because the whole plot of that movie is these rich people using them as mules to traffic diamonds.
I mean, it's just, well, to me, it really just comes off as a medium budget animated friendly family film that was kind of just like Trolls by like, it could be any CGI property and people just forgot about it, and it just has chipmunks as the IP, and it's so dated and so embarrassing and so bad that it's just like, I know it doesn't belong anywhere, but it's like somebody made sense of it or somebody was traumatized by it. So again, I think when somebody writes, literally write about anything. It doesn't have to follow a Christian agenda. Like if you go to any like Christian blog, especially if you look at like blogs from like 20, 30 years prior, it seems like the cliche of Christian blogs is what would Jesus do, or what does the Bible say about this album, or something really goofy. Right. And you see this kind of Christian idealism through white nationalist blogs, communist blogs, even through like Vice magazine, where it's like, why Bronze Age pervert is feminist, or why the Angry Birds movie is a right-wing film. It's like these ideals, these irrational compare and contrast, really, I think, comes from Christianity. This ideal of where's the religion, where's the logos behind the text, and sometimes it isn't there, so people just make it up out of thin air. That's why people will say like really goofy shit, like somebody writes their PhD that SpongeBob SquarePants is a form of Hawaiian colonialism, and they're all mutated because of the Bikini Atoll. That's a real one. I love that one, actually. Some people will say that. What?
Well, I heard people say that like Ed, and Eddie were just like the disembodied spirits of kids that were dead or something.
So that's a good, things like that. Or you could say like Shrek is a communist film about like these really goofy, uncucked philosophy or cucked philosophy ideals of getting the band Suicide, Gilles Deleuze, and the Roland CR-78, and somehow three different factions of ideals are all in the same egalitarian canon. It's just, again, you don't drink milk and pasta together, otherwise you'll get sick. And some of these zero books verso writers don't understand that. They're just in it for this like superfluous creative writing market that's like really doesn't open eyes and really just is like, ew, white nationalism, My Little Pony. Like it does that. Is that really? And so you have to be very critical of that kind of ideals, because sometimes you may dig in the surface and you won't find anything. You won't find the needle in the haystack. And so, but then again, sometimes you can just write about why the Chipmunks sucks and why the trauma bonding film, and it's funny. But then sometimes it's like, well, you're not making anything like this big political bravado about how we should think about things, like what Mark Fisher would say about acid communism. Sometimes it's like, I just want to write about my travels, or I want to write about why I love the board game Diplomacy. It doesn't have to have this ideal of, I was just on my Twitter right now and I just said, NSYNC just got back together again. They had a new song called Better Place. So, that means Justin Timberlake, all the four members, and the song was written for the Trolls film. And so it's like, I can imagine like on Countercurrents, like some idiot is going to be like, why NSYNC's Better Place is about ethno-nationalism, and why like in this progressive liberal society, our real better place is a white nationalist society and everybody will naturally segregate. You can't really uncover that because NSYNC still sucks. NSYNC is still Justin Timberlake. It doesn't matter if 20 years later, they're okay, it's funny they came back and reformed and they wrote a song for a kid's film, but it doesn't move any culture forward or anything. That you're just art sniffing. If it's going back to the whole McDonald's thing.
Yeah, because there used to be this awesome website a long time ago called NSYNC Induces Vomiting. And I was just going to mention Chris's comment really quick. He wrote an article because he used to write for crack.com, and he wrote an article about how Cloak and Dagger was the prequel to Fight Club.
I mean, Chuck Palahniuk's another thing, but again, the point I'm trying to make is like, just like you're saying about the McDonald's Japanese anime commercial, it's like, well, that's for Japan. The Western audiences are probably furious about it because they're envious and just jealous because they wish they were in Japan or an anime realist life. And so you have to understand that if NSYNC has the cultural power to like get back together 20 years later to make a song for a kid's film, and at the end of the day, there's like nothing about white nationalism in it, and yet you'll have someone like demanding because of some power play conflict. And I mean, this will have to be, we'll have to talk about this another time, but this is why you have like a synthetic right or compatible right happening, where you have places like Compact Magazine, where the editor, Geoff Schutenberg, or whatever his name is, he's like writing articles about like why Bronze Age pervert is feminism, or like why things are social construction theory, and like anybody could be culturally fascist or right wing. And to me, this is just like liberal Trojan horsing, or again, a compatible right. And this is like sponsored by the New York Times and the New Yorker. And it's the same thing what has happened to the synthetic, the left, with the creation of the synthetic left, the ideal of postmodernity. And I always think it really first starts with the Gramsci fallacy that, oh, well, culture derives from politics. You can't have culture if the culture is this kind of artificial consumer thing of subjective interest, and that you have to first define spaces of area and then culture arises. There's this obsession with culture because we live in a liberal capitalist society which creates individual preferences, and people are not really questioning the economic reality, and hence why you have these Gramscian Trotskyites people constantly infiltrating the text and assuming in sync is white nationalism or something. But that's the long story short. It's super silly. Maybe I'm overthinking about this, but I've just been seeing the trend over and over again.
It's not really false because, I mean, that's what Andrew proposed, in every debate he's had about Christian nationalism, or every discussion, is we're going to do the long march into the institutions. We're going to homeschool our kids. We're going to have as many babies as possible. And we're just going to outbreed all our enemies.
But the problem is you're just following orders. And that's just the problem is, one, you're following orders by what the state says. And two, that's a variant of Marxist theory from Trotsky and Gramsci. So it's like, how can you just invert it and assume it's anti-Marxist? It has a Marxist base to it. So it's like people just being illiterate or just being ignorant about things and just assuming it's a form of, you think about things, right? You have to cleanse your mind from sin by stop thinking about women. And then therefore you'll be cleansed of lust. And you see that same thing, this so-called culture war fetishization, is that if I role model a certain way, then things revolve around me. It's almost like a form of solipsism or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's so
Again,
funny.
I don't have the answers, but it's just like, I thought about writing about this, but I'm very skeptical of the ideal that quote unquote politics derives from culture, because the only thing I'm going to say is that Michael Parenti in 2006 wrote a book called The Culture Clash. I think that's what it's called. I have my copy. I just haven't got to it yet. But basically Parenti, late Marxist, still alive, is just very old. He read Gramsci and he was very interested in Gramsci, but he's also very critical of Gramsci because, he said that Gramsci was writing during a time where technology was advanced enough to have mass media, but Gramsci tends to forget that it's really just rather individual basis and not the full spectrum of things, and that people sometimes they're confusing culture with tradition. And Parenti's making those observations as a Marxist point of view. And again, I'm not seeing enough. There's not enough criticisms of Gramsci from the Marxist point of view. And I've just been reading about it for some time, and it's just silly if you boil down things about culture, because then the right doesn't have an argument. The right is kind of just this reactionary scarecrow for the left, or boogeyman for the left. That's like, ooh, you're right wing. And then the right just spouts everything the left is saying, but they're too afraid to read Marx because it's radioactive, even though they're reading Marxist theory of the baby boomer generation and not of now. And that's where we get the ideals of a synthetic left, the partisan review, synthetic right takes. But again, I have to get to Michael Parenti's work. I just ordered some of his books, and I'm definitely going to read it when I get back, but from the States.
Well, it's also just really funny when somebody calls themselves a Paleo Con when they've never read like Paul Gottfried or.
Right. It's like, it's really hard there's subcultural labels and that are very niche. It's hard to even call yourself a communitarian, and though no one has ever read Murray Bookchin, right? And that was just something he made out of thin air because he was like a Spinoza type that was mad at the white leftist anarchist types, and he was making arguments for like almost a libertarian type of anarchy. And people think that just means communitarianism, even though communism in its name says communes. This is like Tony Negri says in his book about, the Commonwealth. And yet Murray Bookchin is a wholly different beast.
Well, it's just kind of like when ANCAPs and libertarians say, well, because they were called National Socialist, they must be socialist.
Social. That's like PragerU point. That's like the traditional American Republican. Every single part of the Republican Party or PragerU, and yes, libertarians think, well, it says socialists, they're obviously socialists, which I would love to say they're Strasserites or like race realists that's anti-capitalist. That would be cool, but unfortunately, there's more history to it. And then when you ask fellow Marxists like David Harvey or Richard Wolff, they'll say another weird line, quote unquote, fascism is just capitalism and decay, which is a half truth and not the full story. And again, we go back to Paul Gottfried and kind of his Stanley Payne and the history of fascism and people like Zoltanis and all that. So it's very, seems like we're talking about accelerationism, the concept of decay. And that is true that when you have a society that builds up and then you have forms of people becoming contrarian, yes, that is a form of the system decaying, but it can't be reductive to everything is just capitalism. Everything I don't like is capitalism. So that's what I'm iffy about. And again, there's nothing wrong about being an actual nationalist and a socialist. I believe that communism and nationalism are not dialectically opposed. And in fact, I would say, I'm not to sound like an Epoch Times Republican or a totalitarian hater by saying, oh, they're both the same. No, I'm saying they're both rich and they're both unique idealisms. And you can have a nationalist who's also a communist, or a communist that supports nationalism, and that just gets into ethno-nationalism and all that. And so,
well, that's why trad culture. I was going to say really quick. That's why trad culture earlier was saying that like fascism is actually a more extreme version of communism, because you pretty much are just a piece of the collective or a part of the body. That's basically
it's an Italian variant of Sorelianism, the ideal that there's a myth. That there's a paternal system that you must protect and everyone must become strong. I mean, I love the whole cultural fascist ideal. I wrote this for Arctos. I wrote an article, Cultural Fascism, for Arctos.com, which is basically Duginist like publishing house.
Right. So, but it also turns a lot of people into just a bunch of worker ants trying to fight, you know, in a war, in a bloody war.
Again, not to go back to like Hannah Arendt or like Susan Sontag or like the pro-American anti-totalitarian thinking. The point is there are just some people that like nationalism and communism. And if you have a nationalist who say, you know, communism, socialism is some evil, nefarious Jewish creation, that's a recent invention that was brought up by Christian religious types of the E. Michael Jones types that it's only been around, I would say, for about like 70 years. And yet throughout the history of communism, a lot of the communists had ideals that were almost akin to like proto-fascist, proto-Nat-Socs. And so I don't think...
I mean, they're just two sides of the same coin to me. I mean, anybody
and so
who
I would assume that nationalists and communists should just shake hands because they're both innate things that you can't get rid of.
I mean, they're both going to be collective authoritarian societies that are going to expect the duties of their citizens to go above their rights.
It's just that the American audience thinks that we should just like listen to Susan Sontag and think all totalitarian systems are evil, and therefore the only true, you know, there is no alternative is like a liberal capitalism, which is like goofy as hell. But a point in being, I would like to see more of the nationalists, the so-called subcultural people who call themselves nationalists, be more open about Marx, Sorel, anti-capitalist thought, socialism, because they're not dialectically opposed. You can have Palestinian nationalists and they can be socialists. You can have, you know, I mean, there's some paleoconservatives that are like Jewish nationalism means Zionism, and therefore they would have white nationalism. Ideally, if you're an ethno-nationalist, you would also believe someone has a people's right to support communists. So ethno-nationalists would give it their altruistic right to support a party which is dialectically, quote unquote, opposed to them when really it's not. So I don't know. Well, I mean, just going around in circles here.
Yeah, like I'm more of a traditionalist these days. So I mean, and when I say traditionalist, I'm not talking Evola traditionalism. I'm talking more like hunter-gatherer traditionalism. But it is fascinating because in a modern society, because you know, civilizations, have cycles. There's always going to be that part of the cycle where things start to just like get really ugly, where a civilization will collapse, and then you will have like a communist revolution or a fascist uprising, and then after a while like everything will default back to the other order that it was. Right. And the cycle
it's like a whole nother conversation, but it's just my rhetoric I'm just trying to say is that I'm just sick of people who say that they're nationalist and opposed to all evil forms of the so-called left, which completely the left-right binary is a mistake. And
It
people, and because the very people who call themselves nationalists are just clones of Trotsky and Gramsci, saying Marxist rhetoric and then assuming that all my enemies don't know that culture derives from politics. Therefore, Sesame Street is Duganism or something really. And if it is, then that's just a byproduct of the capitalist system. Because as we said before, if we ask Edward Dutton or some of the Gen X, human biodiversity types, they don't really have issues with revolving around, economics. They could talk about how race is real, but they're just like, well, for capitalism, you just got to put it with like good people with virtue, and then I guess profit aligns with virtue, and everything gets solved. And it's like they really have simpleton, like they're not good answers. So again, it's bigger than what we think it is, and it's really, I know, I just seeing a bunch of Twitter users who call themselves nationalist and they have to hate communism. It just makes everything worse, and it gives the argument of the opposition, the Haas types, a better argument. And it frames things in such what we'd also call quote unquote bad optics.
Yeah, and so like the last thing I'm going to address before ending the stream is this question about what do we think about the internet drama between Jay Dyer and Haas? Well, I think the problem with that is like Dyer is who he is. So I mean, he blocks people. He gets really spurgy and strict about his debate tactics. And then Haas, is also a total spurg. So he's going to chimp out and get really angry when things inconvenience him. So yeah, it wasn't going to work out too well between them two debating. I mean, Haas wanted a civil debate where they could have had a detailed debate, but Jay Dyer thinks materialism is bullshit. So, I mean, he just basically thinks Haas is just, full of crap and can't make a good argument. And when Haas says knowledge is feeding, Dyer just laughed at him and mocked him and kicked him out of the Twitter space. And then that pissed off Haas a ton.
I think both of them come from very niche categories of the mind. And both of them, Jay Dyer likes Christian Gnosticism and Twin Peaks. Haas likes old Marxism and video games. And you add two weird people obsessed with their weird niche markets together, then you will never have an agreement on one thing. You'll have this kind of weird framing of things that don't make any sense. Like, I certainly wouldn't want to hear on Haas's behalf, why Jesus myth theory and Gnosticism and this ideal that we should like Christ. And then on Jay Dyer's side, I certainly wouldn't want to hear Christianity as quote unquote fascist or something like that. So it's just like the semantics and syntax is so tangled that it just becomes this really goofy fish tank. What happens if we put a piranha and an archerfish in the same room?
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyways, thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll catch you all next time.
All right. Talk to you guys soon.